Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Sorry to interrupt you on your first answer, but we are going to have to cross to the House of Commons, where the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, is on the floor.
Hundreds of hours of debate in the other place. May I beg your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, by paying tribute to my ministerial team who brought the bill so far. The honourable members for Wickham, for Worcester, for Swindon South, for Esher Walton and for Aylesbury. And in the other place, the Leader of the House of Lords, Baroness Evans, and her team, Lord Callanan, Lord Keane, Baroness Goldie, Lord Duncan and Lord Bourne, and extend the same thanks to the front benches of the opposition as well. It's worth at this early point remembering that this bill has a simple, clear purpose, ensuring the whole of the United Kingdom has a functioning statute book on the day we leave the European Union. This involves a considerable task of converting 40 years of European Union law into United Kingdom law. This is an unprecedented task carried out under a strict timetable. And the government respects the constitutional role the House of Lords has played in scrutinising this legislation. We have listened, whenever possible, to sensible suggestions that have been made to improve the bill. But where amendments have been made that seek to, or inadvertently, undermine the essential purpose of the bill to provide a smooth and orderly exit, or undermine the referendum result, we must reject them. For example, on the interpretation of CJEU case law, we have worked closely with the former law lords such as Lord Hope, Lord Judge, Lord Brown, Lord Neuberger and Lord Thomas to develop a solution that's genuinely improved the bill. Our other Lords' amendments represent the outcome of similarly productive discussions. The role of the House of Lords is a clear one: to scrutinise legislation that comes from this House, not to recast or repurpose it. But of course it should not undermine the decisions that put the British people in manifestos or referendums. This House's improvements to the bill, the Commons' improvements to the bill, span a number of areas, from narrowing the types of deficiencies that can be corrected using delegated powers in the bill, to bolstering the rights of individuals by extending the ability to bring certain challenges under the general principles to 3 months after exit day. Mr. Speaker, I will address in turn the main issues where the House of Lords has asked this House to think again in this group, but where their Lordship approach has either undermined the essential purpose of the bill or attempted to overrule well-considered amendments from this House. The first such area is the sifting system originally proposed in this House by my honourable friend, the member for Broxbourne, the chairman of our Procedure Committee. This recommended that the committee would consider negative instruments brought forward under the main powers of the bill and could recommend they instead be subject to the affirmative procedure. It followed the unanimous recommendation of the Commons Cross-Party Procedure Committee. This was clearly a recommendation born out of careful and detailed consideration by the committee, and the government was happy to accept it. My honourable friend's amendments were agreed by this House following an extensive debate. What we have back from the Lords, which are amendments 110 and 128, is both an imposition on our procedures by the other place and a threat to the workability of the whole process of correcting the statute book. This is for two important reasons. First, a binding recommendation from the sifting process, not a recommendation at all. It's an instruction to the government that will mark a significant departure from the established procedures for handling secondary legislation. It's equally unacceptable, as the chair of the Procedure Committee has noted, for the opinion of the Committee of the unelected House to govern procedure in this place. And the Common Procedure Committee's proposals do have teeth. As the honourable member for Broxbourne said on the 12th of December, and I quote, "The political cost to my frontbench colleagues of going against the sifting committee recommendation would be significant. The committee will have to give a reason why it's in disagreement. The minister will be summoned to explain his or her department's position, and it will be flagged up on the order paper if a particular SI has not been agreed between a sifting committee and the government. That will result in a significant political cost." And he's right. Second, while I understand the concern about the required pace at which committees will have to operate, an extra 5 sitting days, which is what the Lords propose, risks taking the process for a negative SI into what might well be its 5th or 6th calendar week. This will seriously jeopardise our ability to deliver a functioning statute book in time, And on our side, the government is poised to do everything we can to support the speedy work of the sifting committees. Mr. Speaker, on a slightly wider point, I understand that the House of Lords wants to improve the bill in various ways, and each of some of their changes individually can seem sensible and proportionate when seen in isolation. But the cumulative effect of these changes can sometimes make it impossible to deliver the smooth and orderly exit we want. I turn now to the question of exit day. After considering the issue at length, this House accepted the amendments proposed by my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, which set exit day in the bill, but also allowed that time to be altered in the unlikely event that the exit date under Article 50 differed from that written into the bill. This is a sensible approach. It provides certainty as to our exit day, but also incorporates the terms of Article 50. Remember, exit day will be determined by international law rather than by this House. This was the issue we discussed at length when we passed the Notification of Withdrawal Act. Their Lordships have suggested this House abandons the conclusion of these lengthy and considered debates we've already had on this issue by returning the bill in broadly the same state as it was first introduced. Now, I accept the helpful scrutiny of the Lords in many areas of the bill, but this House has already reached a sensible position which commanded a significant majority, and we propose to adhere to the original decision of this House on this matter. Mr. Speaker, at the heart of this bill are the delegated powers that are essential to the United Kingdom's orderly departure from the European Union. These powers will ensure the statute book continues to function as we leave the European Union. As we've consistently said, we do not take these powers lightly. That's why, in addition to the changes approved by this House, we made further amendments in the Lords. When using the principal powers in the bill, ministers must now give their good reasons for the changes they're making, exactly as the Lords Constitution Committee recommended. We've introduced further safeguards by preventing the powers in the bill from being used to establish public authorities. And we've removed the international obligations power from the bill entirely, as it's become clear that there are better and more effective ways to ensure that the government's international obligations continue to be met than through their use of this power. This means the approach we now have before us is substantially different to what we first introduced while protecting the core purpose of the bill. It represents the government having listened to the views of Parliament throughout the bill's passage. But what we cannot do, Mr. Speaker, is accept Lords Amendments 10, 43 and 45, which replace the word appropriate as a reason for using the powers to necessary. This House has accepted the premise of the government's approach to delivering a functioning statute book. Specifically, that we would preserve and incorporate EU law and then make the appropriate corrections via secondary legislation. Given the scale and speed necessary, this could never have been done using primary legislation. But at every turn, we have sought to ensure proper scrutiny from Parliament. Given that this fundamental premise has been supported, there needs to be sufficient flexibility for ministers to propose changes which might not be strictly considered necessary, but everybody here would think appropriate. I'll give way in a moment, yes. Mr. Speaker, necessary is not a synonym for sensible, logical or proper. It means something that's essential that needs to be done. I'll give way to it.
To the Secretary of State for giving way. Does he recall that in the original White Paper on the Great Repeal Bill, the government pledged only to make changes to retained EU law by delegated legislation where necessary? That's at page 21. And does he accept that if this House doesn't accept the Lords' amendments, the government will be breaking the pledge they made in their original White Paper?
No, with great respect, Honourable Lady, she's a lawyer. She knows the words in an Act of Parliament matter, and they matter very precisely, rather more than an individual word. They matter very precisely. And let me explain why. Let me explain in a second. For example. As I said, necessary is not a synonym for sensible, logical or proper. For example, correcting inconsistencies, changing terminology, removing redundant provisions or improving clarity and accessibility. In many cases, such changes could be left unmade, even if the consequences are perverse. But that's not the best outcome for businesses or individuals across the United Kingdom. I do not believe their Lordships intended to constrain our ability to change the names of documents like European aviation documentation. nor do I think they intend to require us to use cumbersome terms like national regulatory authorities of member states and then having to designate our national regulators underneath that. This would be an inefficient way of making Ofcom the regulator for our open access internet legislation, for example. This will be UK law applied only in the UK. It will be confusing to businesses and individuals to keep laws which suggest otherwise. But these changes, whilst appropriate, may fail the test of necessary. I'll give way to my honourable friend. My right.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, because I understand the point he's making, but I have to say I'm not sure I agree with him. I think that all the examples he's given would meet the necessity test without any difficulty at all. Where the necessity test provides a higher bar is that if it were thought that a minister was using these powers to change legislation in a way which wasn't necessary, then he would be prevented from doing it. And I just don't think the examples he's giving the House, I have to say to him, I just don't think that that would be a problem for the minister at all.
Well, my right honourable friend, I know from a long time, is a very good lawyer. But other lawyers, I'm afraid, disagree quite seriously. Now, the Lord's amendments effectively increase the risk of judicial review. And what that does, and what that does, and this is an incredibly serious point, what that does is ask judges to make a policy decision that this House should be making in saying yes or no to a statutory instrument. It really is as simple as that. I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm rather sorry he's so distrustful of judges to deal on essentially procedural matters and constitutional matters. But could he possibly define appropriate to me? Because it's one of those vague words which I suspect means if the minister feels that he or she wants to, one way or the other. And it cannot be, almost certainly a decision could not be challenged by judicial review because the word is so wide and vague, there's no conceivable argument that could be raised to challenge the minister's opinion. And we can't take powers in that way, enabling the government to change legislation on what will be important matters to some individuals entirely at the minister's uncontrolled discretion.
Well, I hear my right honourable friend and old friend. I mean, we are still capable of having a dinner for 2 hours and not talking about Europe throughout it, or lunch. He paid, it was lunch. The simple fact is that we're not just leaving it to the single word. And as I said earlier in this section, the House of Lords Constitution Committee looked at this both in the context of this bill and also in the context of the sanctions bill, and said that what we should do is require the minister to give good reasons. That was the test. Give good reasons, and that's what we have proposed in our amendment. So in these terms, if you'll forgive me, I'll make a little progress because the next section, I'm quite sure, will provoke quite a lot more interventions than the last one. Because I want to turn to the question of parliamentary approval of negotiations. Now, turning now, Mr. Speaker, to Lord's Amendment 19 on Parliament's approval of the outcome of negotiations. This was, in effect, in the other House, described by Lord... The amendment, which is the Hailsham Amendment, was described in the other House by Lord Villamoria as the No Brexit Amendment. Now, what it actually amounts to is an unconstitutional shift which risks undermining our negotiations with the European Union. It enables Parliament to dictate to the government its course of action in international negotiation. Well, what's wrong with that? I'll read them a quote from Professor Vernon Bogdanor, not exactly a well-known leaver, a constitutional expert, who described this at the weekend as, quotes, a constitutional absurdity that would weaken the position of Britain's negotiators. Now, I agree with him that this is not practical. In a moment, it's not practical, not desirable, and it's not appropriate. Long on this issue.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. What the Lord's Amendment seeks to do is to reassert parliamentary sovereignty such that this House approves and gets to vote on every scenario that can be conceived of in terms of the way that we withdraw from the European Union. In terms of the Secretary of State's amendment, can I ask him a factual question? And I'm not asking him whether he thinks we will be in a situation where there is no deal or not. I'm simply asking him this. Is it not the case that his amendment to that Lord's Amendment 19 gives his government a passport to take this country out of the European Union with no deal, with this House having had no say on it whatsoever?
I start by saying to the honourable gentleman, I respect his point of view. He does have the honesty to say he would like us to stay within the European Union, irrespective of the referendum result. And whilst I disagree with it, that is an honest position to take. But what he describes as giving the government the right to take us out of the European Union under, frankly, any circumstances, was Article 50, which was passed through this House and the other House by very large majorities. So, you know, I'm afraid it's not right in that respect. Now if you, for a moment, I'll give way in a moment. In a moment. It is accepted practice that governments negotiate treaties, and this was the case for the European Communities Act 1972, Lisbon Treaty, Nice Treaty, Amsterdam Treaty, and Maastricht Treaty. I don't remember any argument that Parliament was about to undertake, or should be about to undertake those treaties from people who today argue that this amendment is appropriate. Now, furthermore, the amendment, I give way to the honourable gentleman. I do hope that wasn't the Whip's office.
No, our Whip's office is clearly kind. I hope our Whip's office is clearly kinder than the government's Whip's office is going to be on getting this measure through. But, Mr. Speaker, I will hope to catch your eye to talk about what the effects on the Labour vote in those constituencies that voted to leave in a moment. But on this crucial issue, is it not true, if we pass what the Lords want us to do, we, as Aneurin Bevan said, will be sending our negotiators back naked into the negotiating room. The European Union will know that the government is beaten and they can impose any terms whatsoever on them.
Well, the right honourable gentleman makes a very good point in that it is certainly the case that the European Commission reads every newspaper in Britain, particularly the Financial Times and Times, that they read them all. More surprisingly, they believe them. But the simple truth is that they do look at any options which they think the British political system will throw up, which will allow them to get negotiating advantage. And remember too that for most of the 27, if not all of the 27, they would much rather we didn't leave full stop. And if they see an opportunity to create that outcome, that's what they will do. And so he's right in that. Not for the moment. I'll make a little progress and then give way again. Furthermore, this Lord's Amendment sets deadlines which would simply allow the other side to use time against us, as they already tried to do. What we have proposed in lieu, Mr. Speaker, is an amendment which builds on commitments which I first set out to this House in a statement on the 13th of December last year. The amendment provides that the withdrawal agreement cannot be ratified unless both the agreement and future framework have been approved by a motion of this House. It also prevents the agreement from being ratified unless an Act of Parliament has been passed to implement it. And this is all before the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act as well. So this is in addition to the government's commitment to introduce the Withdrawal Agreement and Implementation Bill if Parliament votes in favour of a final deal. In a moment. Yes, all right, I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for giving way. What's not clear is what are the choices on a meaningful vote? Is the meaningful vote going to be between the deal that might be struck at the European Union and this current status quo, or might it be between a deal struck at the European Union with the European Union and WTO? Because we need to know this.
What I'll say to him, people keep using the phrase meaningful vote, but what it conceals in some cases, and I suspect in his case this is the case, that they want to reverse the result of the referendum. And nothing we do will be organised to allow a reversal of the result of the referendum. I'll give way in a moment to the honourable gentleman. In a moment. The government has also made provisions to allow the vote to happen in this House before the European Parliament votes on a deal, as long as it's practical. This follows the spirit of the Lord's Amendment, but our proposal has some significant differences. First, we've attached a deadline to the Lord's consideration of a motion on the final deal. It's not right that the Lords could have a veto on the deal simply by filibustering or refusing to consider the motion. And anyone suggests this is unlikely, I should point out it was actually a concern raised by the Lordships themselves in debate. No, not for the moment. Second, we've removed Parliament's power to give binding negotiating directions to the government. As I've said, this would represent a profound constitutional shift in the terms of which branch of the state holds the right to act in the international sphere. I turn again to Vernon Bogdanor, who said, Parliament's role is to scrutinise legislation and policy. 650 MPs, still less 800 peers, cannot themselves negotiate. In a moment. Instead, we have provided that in the event that Parliament rejects the deal put to it, the government will be legally obliged to make a statement on its proposed next steps in relation to Article 50 negotiations within 28 days of that rejection. This House would, of course, then have plenty of tools at its disposal to respond. But I'm as confident as ever that we secure an agreement to which this House will want to support. Now, I give way to my honourable friend. Yeah.
I think everybody in this House would accept my right honourable friend's proposition that we can't bind in negotiation. But clearly the point of concern is this, and he's getting to the point now, which is that if there were to be no deal, does the amendment in lieu cover that circumstance? And if not, could he say how he proposes to deal with that?
Well, I said to honourable friend this. I mean, if there were no deal, as a result of some other reason than the House rejecting it, I mean, I think it's incredibly, almost implausibly unlikely, but imagine the government decided that it would not have a deal at all. Then we, of course, would do the same thing and come back to the House, make the statement, make the statement to the House, and, of course, the House then itself would have the right to respond. I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend.
You can see debating is underway now on the amendments brought forward by the Lords to the EU Withdrawal Bill. I should say, given that this is going to be a day of crucial votes, that the timetable motion, the programme motion for the debate was won by the government by 321 to 304. That's a majority of 17. It means that the first set of crucial votes are going to come just after 4 o'clock this afternoon. We will, of course, have live coverage of those. But what we've been seeing is the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, laying out his case, but coming under pretty strong legal attack from some eminent QCs, the former Cabinet Minister Ken Clarke and also Dominic Grieve. There, who has put forward some amendments and who, of course, defeated the government back in December. Well, let's go now to our political editor, Faisal Islam, who is in the lobby of the Houses of Parliament, the central lobby. And, of course, Faisal Islam, this is going to be, to a certain extent, all about maths, given that the government doesn't have a majority in Parliament, and given that there are some Tory rebels now joined today by that defector Philip Lee giving up his job as a Justice Minister.
Yes, and what David Davis is doing right now is the real crunch point for whether that Philip Lee resignation mushrooms in some way, because David Davis right now, in what he's describing, has to persuade putative rebels, people who they thought they'd got back on side, that with some concessionary language, perhaps, if not a full concession, on the likes of what Dominic Grieve has been suggesting around this meaningful vote. At the moment, the position of the government is foursquare behind their own amendment, which suggests they'll just come back if there's a no deal from the Commons, if they don't vote for the withdrawal deal, but they'll just come back after 28 days and make a statement. There's plenty not enough for a number of Tory MPs. And so they're listening very carefully to the tone of what he says. Whether or not he will, for example, say we'll come back when this goes back to the Lords, which it will do next Monday, and offer some of what Dominic Grieve is asking for. Because make no mistake, the Philip Lee resignation has thrown everything up in the air. The numbers aren't quite certain anymore. They were never particularly certain, but it did seem as if the government was going to get its way. But let's just take those numbers from the programme motion, 321 to 304, with no Tory rebels. You add in the 7 rebels that we think we know about, and you're up to 314 versus 311 with no other changes. So absolutely on a knife edge. If any other Tory MP now feels, rather than voting for the government, they want to abstain, that could make the difference. On the other side, if a Labour sort of Brexiter thinks, well, I'm not going to allow this to happen, they could change the equation. Really tight stuff, and the programme motion illustrates why Julian Smith, the Chief Whip, is in there counting number of MPs who are there, and we'll be listening very carefully to see the interjections from otherwise supportive Tory MPs. Philip Lee's resignation is really quite interesting. I don't get the sense this is part of some coordinated effort to try and defeat the government on this vote today. Mr Lee has had some well-known concerns about the direction of travel on Brexit, and some of what he said when he resigned dramatically during a speech at a think tank is pretty remarkable, saying that the government was only offering a fake choice on Brexit, that's a reference to this meaningful vote amendment, that he will vote to keep in the bill. He also said that he felt that there were real questions for the government's overall strategy on Brexit. He also said that he'd back going back to the people for when the exit deal is done, which is clearly not a governmental position. No, I don't get the sense that this was a coordinated effort to try to upend this particular vote, but it was a sense that things are febrile, a sense that I think he calculates that there could well be some sort of leadership contest within the next month, and he felt that it was important to get his message out right now. So a big blow on a morning like this, on an already tight vote, that a minister resigns. The question now, there's various rumours floating around, is whether anybody might join him, which really would upend the Chief Whip's maths. We await that vote within the next couple of hours or so.
And I don't think that this bill can finish its course and get royal assent until we have that.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his view on this. He sort of expressed it in an amendment which he put down late last night, so I only saw it this morning. I haven't really had a lot of time to This is an interesting demonstration of the Labour Party's perception of how easy it is to make constitutional law on the fly. I think their own voters will come to a view on that. Let me say with respect to my right honourable friend's proposed amendment. I'm happy to, as he knows, I'm always open to him, although he seems to have fallen foul of my telephone security systems, but I'm always open to have a conversation with him on this. But I will always want to keep three principles in mind. Aiming towards his concern, keep three principles in mind. First, we must never do anything that undermines the government's negotiating position or encourages delays in the negotiations. That's very, very important. Secondly, we cannot change the fundamental constitutional structure which makes the government responsible for international relations and international treaties. In a moment, please. We cannot do that. It has stood for hundreds of years and many, many thousands of treaties. As I said earlier, nobody suggested for a moment that the House of Commons should negotiate the Maastricht Treaty or the Lisbon Treaty or one or two other controversial treaties that were in front of the House, and we cannot change that now on the basis of this. Thirdly, we must under all circumstances respect the result of the referendum. That's what this House voted on in Article 50, and that's what. So I'm very happy to talk to him again in the next day or two, on the next day or two, and we can discuss how we can meet his concerns in that time within those principles. Now, all right, I will.
Is not the kernel of the problem that all these amendments proposed by my right honourable friend for Beaconsfield and others make a deal, no deal, more likely because they give every incentive to the European Commission not to agree to a deal, and therefore they bind the government, and we will end up with the worst possible result. Therefore, they should be resisted.
Well, my right honourable friend goes to the heart of the problem, that we have to consider anything done in this House and done in the other House, anything passed will actually have a very serious effect on the negotiating strategy of the other side. So I hope this House will recognise that the government has taken a fair and positive approach to this new clause, retaining those elements which are sensible and viable, while removing those elements that are practically and constitutionally untenable. These constitutional and practical concerns also apply to Lord's Amendment 20 on a mandate for negotiations on a future relationship. The government cannot demonstrate the flexibility necessary for successful negotiation if its hands are tied midway through that process. That will do nothing but guarantee a bad deal for Britain. But it's for the government to set the direction during the negotiation. That's the key point. Mr. Speaker, I do not need to remind the House about the importance of this legislation. The purpose of this bill is to maintain a functioning and effective statute book when leaving the European Union, a statute book that people and business can rely on. That's what our approach will deliver. I beg to move.
Order. The question is that Lord's Amendment 110 be disagreed to. Mr. Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by paying tribute to their lordships for the diligent and considered manner in which they so thoroughly scrutinised the bill before us? And in particular, can I pay tribute to our colleagues in the other place for the extensive efforts they put into securing many of the cross-party amendments that we are debating today? Mr. Speaker, this bill began its life as a fundamentally flawed piece of legislation. And many of its original flaws, I suspect, stem from the fact that at the time it was being drafted, the government had yet to fully work through precisely how withdrawal would have to take place. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, there are some of us who still remember the Secretary of State's glib dismissal of the need for any transitional arrangements after the 29th of March next year, and the misplaced magnanimity with which he made clear that he would only consider granting transitional arrangements in order to be kind to the EU. But as with so many aspects of the Brexit process, even if not yet in every respect, reality has slowly caught up with the government, just as the very real deficiencies in this bill have now been subject to thorough scrutiny in the other place. And if anything has vindicated the opposition's decision to vote against this legislation at second reading, it is the succession of defeats it has faced in both houses, as well as the scores of amendments that government themselves have had to lay to it. That said, Mr. Speaker, after successive defeats in the other place and the latest round of concessions from ministers, some of the worst aspects of the bill have been ameliorated. As we've only had 3 hours of debate in this first group, I intend to touch only briefly on most of the Lord's amendments towards the end of my remarks and focus instead on what we believe to be the critical issue in this first group, and that is the issue of what form parliamentary approval of the withdrawal agreement should take. Mr. Speaker, many of the amendments passed in the other place are of great significance, both in terms of their constitutional implications and in terms of how they might shape what's left of the Brexit process. And it's deeply disappointing that the programme motion only allocates 12 hours of debate to them. I'll give way to Honourable.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Rather than praising the Lords for the number of amendments they've passed, wouldn't it be more in line with Labour Party philosophy and views to say they've gone way beyond their constitutional remit, not only in trying to overturn the decision of the electorate, but also trying to overturn the decisions of both the Labour and the Conservative Party manifestos, which received 84% of the vote at the last general election?
I respect my honourable friend's argument and the long-held views he holds, but I have to fundamentally disagree. None of their lordships' amendments in any way seek to frustrate the Brexit process or allow this House to overturn the referendum result.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and pay tribute to the work that our frontbench Brexit team in this House and in the Lords have done to improve this bill. Can I ask him, because the Secretary of State wasn't courageous enough to take an intervention, what does more to harm the Prime Minister's hand at the negotiating table? Is it the principle of parliamentary consent, or is it the Foreign Secretary making damaging, unguarding remarks at a private dinner? Is it the Brexit Secretary playing the hokey-cokey about whether he's going to stay in the government or not? Or is it the spectacle of government ministers resigning because their own government is too intransigent to listen to the constructive and sensible direction on Brexit that many of us would like to see the government pursue?
My honourable friend makes a good point. There is nothing more damaging, and the Secretary of State said it himself, the EU monitor developments in this House and what's said across the country with great interest, and they see the open warfare in the Cabinet, the open disagreement, and the Foreign Secretary continually undermining the Prime Minister's approach. I'm just going to make some progress. Thank you. Lord's Amendment 19, Mr. Speaker, is of critical importance. In many ways, it is the most important amendment that we will consider over the 12 hours allotted. Before I explain why and set out the reasons why we agree with Lord's Amendment 19 and disagree with the government's proposed Amendment 19A that seeks to replace it, it's worth taking a little time to remind the House how we arrived at this point. As you may recall, Mr. Speaker, before the 7th of February last year, Parliament was to be given absolutely no role in approving the final terms of the UK's exit from the EU, because there was no commitment from the government of a parliamentary vote of any kind. Then, under pressure, the then Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Clwyd West, came to the dispatch box during the committee stage of the EU notification of withdrawal bill with a concession, a vote on a motion in this House and the other place on the Article 50 deal, including the framework for a future relationship. We welcomed that concession, but we were clear that it did not provide for a meaningful vote, merely a vote on a non-binding motion, and one that would essentially take the form of take it or leave it. Accept the final draft withdrawal agreement, I'll give way in 1 second, even if it's found wanting, or accept that the UK will walk away without a deal, triggering the hardest of departures from the EU. I will give way to both.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman giving way. Oh.
Yes, as he intended to the Right Honourable Gentleman, but I think the Honourable Member from the front bench had the Honourable Lady in mind. Emma Reynolds.
I thank my Honourable friend for giving way. Isn't it the case that some of the staunchest Brexiteers, including the Secretary of State himself, have always defended parliamentary sovereignty, but when it comes to a meaningful vote on the deal, they seem to ignore it?
Yes. That's absolutely right, and I thank my honourable friend for that point. I will give way. Yes.
Grateful to him. In this House, some people have been quite clear they want to prevent Brexit. Others disguise that fact by very careful construction of terms. In the Lords, where there's no constituency to vote them out, sadly, people have been more honest. And surely he was wrong to say there was nobody in the Lords who was saying that this was actually a stop Brexit vote. We've already had quotation. The aim was to prevent Brexit. They'd have no responsibility to anybody, and they said that was their aim.
I have to disagree with the point my honourable friend makes. I did not say that there were no lordships that do not intend to block Brexit, just as there are not honourable members in this House for whom that is their intention. But the aim of the Lords' amendments is not to frustrate Brexit as they are designated. And there is no majority in this House. There is no majority in this House for overturning the referendum result, as he well knows, and it's disingenuous to say that the aim of this amendment is that bill. I'm going to make some progress.
Order. I know that the honourable gentleman from the front bench isn't accusing any individual member of being disingenuous. Well, no, I need it to be clear that that's not the case. If the honourable gentleman would be good enough just to confirm, he's not
happy to clarify.
Making any such suggestion. Good, that's good enough. The honourable gentleman. Mr. Matthew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to make a bit of progress, if that's okay. As I was saying, the choice that faced us under the government's amendment is between the draft withdrawal agreement, even if it's found wanting, and the hardest of departures, the most disorderly exit. And let's remind ourselves what that would mean. Legal chaos, significant damage to our economy, the erection of a hard border in Northern Ireland, and serious harm to Britain's standing in the world. That is why, at committee stage, we tabled new clause 66 that would have guaranteed both houses a vote on the motion on the terms of withdrawal, and just as critically, a vote in the event that no such agreement is reached. I'm going to make a bit of progress. However, we also recognised at committee stage that there were other requirements needed to ensure that Parliament has a meaningful vote, one of which is the need for a vote on a statute. That's why we supported Amendment 7, in the name of the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield and other honourable members, an amendment which ultimately passed this House by 309 votes to 305. That amendment took a slightly different approach, in that it was quite deliberately aimed at restricting the use and limiting the potential abuse of the extensive and wide Clause 9 power in the bill as it then stood. I'll take one to it.
Would the honourable gentleman care to reflect on the fact that the decision to transfer the vote to the people was done quite deliberately and voluntarily by this House by 6-1 as a sovereign act of Parliament, and that is what needs to be respected. Any attempt to reverse that is in fact in defiance of the decision that was taken by Act of Parliament itself.
The right honourable gentleman makes the same point that many others, and I've dealt with it in the sense that their lordship's amendment is not about overturning the referendum revolt. No, it's not at all. No, it's not. It's about giving Parliament a say. I'm just going to finish this first point, if I can. It's about giving Parliament a say in shaping the direction under one scenario that could well occur. I will give way.
Wouldn't be one of the most supreme ironies of this entire Brexit debacle that at the end of it we had the European Parliament with a meaningful vote, 27 member states with a meaningful vote, but the state that was leaving in a state, it doesn't have a meaningful vote.
He makes a good point in that the Commission can't approve the deal on the European Union side until the European Parliament has given its consent. And if it doesn't give its consent, they can't move on and ratify it. I said I'd give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making the points about a meaningful vote with a great deal of power. Can he, will he say whether he agrees with me that if we get to a stage, which I suspect some Eurosceptics want, where we're approaching a disorderly, no-deal, hardest of hard Brexits, that this House has a right not to be given a fait accompli to have a deal that's inadequate or no deal at all, and that is what this battle that we're having to have a meaningful vote on the deal is actually all about.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and that is the choice that faces every honourable member in the chamber today when we come to vote on Lord's Amendment 19. I'm going to make some progress. 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 I want to turn back. I want to return to Amendment 7 in the name of the right honourable and learned gentleman. As I said, that amendment took a very different approach, which was about restricting the Clause 9 power. That amendment having passed, the government cannot now give the final withdrawal agreement domestic legal effect without first gaining parliamentary approval in primary legislation for the planned EU withdrawal and implementation bill. But what his Amendment 7 did not do, consciously and deliberately, I remember him saying it at the time, was deal with a scenario in which Parliament does not approve the draft withdrawal agreement, a scenario that I would argue cannot be ruled out given how badly this government are handling the negotiations and the limited time they have left before agreement must be reached. I'm going to make some more progress. With their new clause, the Lordships have developed the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman's Amendment 7 in its guarantee of a statutory vote and made explicit provision for what would happen if Parliament were not to approve the deal when it is put before us later this year. In those circumstances, under the provisions of their amendment, it would be for Parliament, by resolution of this House, and the government to find time for that resolution, and subject to consideration in the other place, to give direction to the government about how then to proceed. It is not about Parliament taking over the negotiations. It is not about stripping ministers of their authority to make decisions. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the member for Greenwich and Woolwich for giving way. He said earlier that there is no Lord's amendment which is there to frustrate the result of the referendum. But Amendment number 19 says very clearly that Her Majesty's Government must follow any direction to the negotiations approved by resolution here or subject to a motion from the House of Lords. That is entirely transferring responsibility for the aims and the detail of everything we negotiate to Parliament and away from government. Can he name any precedent for that in the whole history of this nation?
If such a scenario were to occur, and I think this is the important point, I take head on what the honourable gentleman has said, it would be for Parliament by resolution, and in a sense we're talking about any unknown number of hypothetical situations at that point, to direct the government by resolution. Now, is he saying that Parliament would come forward and support a resolution to overturn the referendum result? There is no way that that could happen. He knows there's no majority for that in this House. No. The aim... No, I'm going to make some progress. I'm going to make some progress. The aim of this amendment is to establish a clear process with appropriate guidelines by which Parliament can approve the outcome of the Article 50 negotiations and to provide clarity on what should happen if the majority of honourable members in this House come to the conclusion that the final deal the government return with is not good enough for the country. I won't give way. I'm not going to give way. I'm going to make some progress. Thank you. It's about ensuring that in a scenario where this House rejects the withdrawal agreement, Parliament does not then simply become a passive spectator to what happens next, but instead secures a decisive role in actively shaping how the executive then proceeds. I'll give way to my friend.
Give way. I thank the honourable for giving way. He has just said that supporting this amendment would not necessarily lead to a resolution of this House saying that we wish to maintain membership of the European Union. Can he explain, for clarity for my purpose, what safeguards are in place to prevent such a thing from happening, given that we cannot bind Parliament? And as such, we could resolve to tell the government that re-entry is the point of negotiation if we vote for this amendment.
He's dealing in hypotheticals, but what I would say, and what I would say under that scenario is there might be the case that an honourable member tries to bring forward a resolution. It might be the case that the government provides time. Does he realistically believe that such a resolution could pass and would command a majority in this House? It wouldn't. This is not about frustrating Brexit. Ministers know full well there is no majority in that place, and it's disingenuous, I said, to argue as much. Lord's Amendment 19 is about trusting this sovereign House of Commons to do what is right for the country. I'll give way.
My friend agree with me that it's government's job to bring forward policy. It's Parliament's job, Commons in particular, to legislate. And it seems to me, far from taking back control or establishing sovereignty, the government appears to want to deny Parliament its fundamental role as
My honourable friend makes a good point, and Mr. Speaker, I am now going to make some progress. Lord's Amendment 19 is about trusting this sovereign House of Commons to do what is right for the country. Should it come to pass, I won't give way, no. Should it come to pass that the government brings back a deal which does not secure approval in this House? In contrast, the government's amendment in lieu, Amendment 19A, would guarantee precisely the opposite. It would ensure that in the event this House does not approve the withdrawal agreement, Parliament would have almost no role whatsoever. Yes, the amendment provides for a statutory guarantee. I'm not going to give way at this point, no. It provides for a statutory guarantee of a vote before the withdrawal agreement is put on the statute book, but it removes from the bill what their lordships deliberately chose to insert: provision for the legislature to constrain ministers from deciding to crash us out of the EU without a deal should Parliament choose to reject it. And what does the government amendment offer in its place? Provision to send a minister back to the House within 28 days with a statement as to how the government intends to proceed. A commitment that does not go much beyond what was set out in the written ministerial statement that was hurriedly issued on the 13th of December in a last ditch to thwart this House from voting for the Right Honourable Learned Gentleman's Amendment 7. I'm not going to give way. I'm going to make some progress. It almost, Mr. Speaker, it almost beggars belief. The vast majority of members of this House want the government to succeed and to return with the best deal possible. But let's be clear what it would mean were the House to decline to approve the deal they bring back. That would represent a catastrophic failure of the government's Brexit policy and its handling of the negotiations. In such a scenario, are honourable members really content for the sum of their role to be the chance to listen to a ministerial statement and to attempt to catch the Speaker's eye to ask a question? Because that is what honourable members will be giving their consent to if they vote for the government's amendment in lieu today. It's the same take it or leave it vote the government offered last year with a few extra baubles. I'll give way.
My friend understands that Labour voters in the Midlands and the North who voted in large numbers to leave the European Union and are a little bemused even at seeing arguments amongst the Cabinet over how it's delivered. do not wish to see the negotiation carried out by 650 members of Parliament. They want to see Brexit got on with. How will we explain to them that an unelected House of Lords, if their amendments are passed, can overturn both the Commons and the referendum? How will Labour voters be explained that?
I'll tell my honourable friend how we explain it to them. We'll say that their lordships asked us to consider and vote on whether in the event that a majority of this House do not approve the deal, that we take control of the situation and shape how the executive then proceeds. And I think they would support that. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress with this. Mr. Speaker, there's been a considerable amount of debate over the past 16 months about what is meant by meaningful when it comes to a meaningful vote. But any member of the public watching today will struggle to understand how a vote on the draft withdrawal agreement that will simply take the form of take it or leave it could any sense be argued to be genuinely meaningful. In reality, it would be anything but. It would be meaningless, not meaningful, a Hobson's choice. I will give way for one final time.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way. Can I just put it to him gently that his proposition presupposes that the European Union would wish to re-engage in negotiation. What he is suggesting, were there to be a meaningful vote and this House was to veto the deal, is that we would be likely to crash out without a deal and not deliver the pragmatic, common-sense Brexit that I think he and I would like to see. Common sense.
No, I disagree with the honourable member. Crashing out of the European Union without a deal is exactly what this amendment is designed to prevent. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I want to turn. I said that was the last intervention. I'm not giving way again. I want to turn briefly to the amendment tabled yesterday evening by the right honourable and learned gentleman, the member for Beaconsfield. We welcome it as a significant improvement on the government's amendment in lieu. His new amendment is a clear acknowledgement that the government's amendment is deficient, that there is a need to make provision for a scenario in which Parliament does not approve a motion on the withdrawal bill agreement, and that this House may need to insist upon a decisive role for Parliament in what would be, we all acknowledge, an unprecedented situation. And we recognise, Mr. Speaker, that the right honourable and learned gentleman throughout this process has been at great pains to try and secure a consensus around how this complex legislation can be improved in the context of the many challenges that the government faces. In taking the approach that him and his colleagues have, their intent has not been, as many have suggested and is plastered across the front of many of the tabloids today, to sabotage the will of the people or betray their country. They are simply trying to secure what the vast majority of honourable members in this House desire: a proper process codified in law which ensures the right decisions are made at the right time, and where Parliament have the tools to effectively hold the executive to account on some of the most significant decisions any of us will be asked to take. I'm not going to give way. I'm going to conclude at this point. The question of what form parliamentary approval of the withdrawal bill takes is one of the most significant decisions this House will have to take. To be meaningful, a vote cannot simply take the form of a binary take it or leave it choice. It must provide a means by which Parliament can indicate to the government that it desires a re-examination of particular aspects of the draft withdrawal agreement, or even a change of approach. But unless honourable members insist on it, Parliament will not have a genuinely meaningful vote on the terms of our withdrawal, as this House insisted upon in December. That's why we must insist upon it, and why I urge honourable members to agree with Law's amendment when we go through the division lobbies in a few hours' time. Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude briefly by turning to some of the other Lord's amendments in this group for clarity. Let me start with Lord's amendments 37, 38 and 125, which we agree with. We remain of the view that amending the bill to incorporate a specified exit day and time was an ill-conceived and unnecessary gimmick that unduly fetters the government. Ministers are well aware, just as they were when they introduced those amendments, that exit day for the purposes of this bill is a very different matter to the actual date on which the UK will cease to be an EU member state, a date that is settled matter and a constitutional legal certainty. Common sense dictates that we return to the situation before November, in which there was a necessary degree of flexibility around exit day for the purposes of the bill, although we agree with their lordships that it is Parliament, not ministers, who would agree the various exit dates. We agree to amendments 115 110 and 128, which we believe strengthen parliamentary scrutiny by ensuring, for example, that ministers cannot overturn decisions made by the triage committee. We also agree to amendments 10, 43 and 45, which rightly circumscribe the scope of the sweeping delegated powers in this bill. We debated this issue extensively at committee stage, and we remain of the view that concerns about the subjectivity inherent in the choice of the word appropriate must be addressed. And lastly, we agree to Amendment 20 and to Amendment 52. Mr. Speaker, I know that many honourable members on both sides wish to speak, so I have not sought to repeat or rebut every argument made about each of the Lords' Amendment in this group, but simply to set out with particular focus on Lords' Amendment 19 why we believe they must be retained. I'm not going to give way at this stage. The issues before us in this group, at their core, are about what we, as honourable and right honourable members, believe the role of Parliament should be in the Brexit process. They are about ensuring that Parliament plays an active role in shaping our country's future, rather than accepting that the House of Commons is to be little more than a spectator, a passive observer to one of the most important decisions that has faced our country in generations. They are about ensuring that the withdrawal agreement cannot be ratified unless we approve it, and in the event we do not approve it, that we ensure that the UK cannot crash out of the EU by ministerial fiat. They are ultimately about reasserting the primacy of this House of Commons, so that this House, should the situation arise, is able to do what is right for our country. Thank you.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for calling me, and may I begin by saying that I will try to be as brief as I possibly can be, and everybody knows for me that's an effort, but I really will try to be positively terse when I can, and I'm afraid I will, if I give way at all, I will give way very briefly, and I think that's only right, because the timetable motion we've just passed, which I voted against, has allowed just 3 hours for this whole debate. I'm well aware that hundreds of members probably will find it almost impossible to get in, and that if I therefore abuse the privilege you've given me, I should be causing a great deal of damage to the quality of the debate. So, firstly, let me say that I've never known an issue of this importance being taken in this way. As one who remembers being in the European Communities Bill debates back in the 1972, I went all the way through Maastricht, hours and hours of debate, repeated votes took place before the approval of this House was obtained. Nobody throughout would have dreamt of arguing that as part of the process the House of Commons could be excluded and the government could now be given an absolute privilege to proceed. Such a suggestion would have been treated as a complete absurdity, and my right honourable friend would certainly not have treated, I won't, I'm afraid, because I don't think my right honourable friend, had the suggestion been put to him during the Maastricht debates that if the government got defeated on a resolution, the government could take it over on its own and let Parliament know in due course what was going to happen, I don't think he would have welcomed. I understand you are in a different position, but no, You've got to give way to him now, Ken. You've got to give way to him. Oh, I will give way to him, but I thought he and I have debated this quite long enough for everybody already. But I will give way.
Would my right honourable friend explain whether he believes that it is possible, with the meaningful vote, to actually manage to maintain the Brexit process? Does he not accept that the effect of a meaningful vote is actually to reverse the Brexit process, and furthermore, that it is, to use an expression, completely failing to understand the nature of the amendment to suggest otherwise?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, who is a genuine personal friend, and always has been, but he's brought me to the point I was going to move on to. This debate is being dominated, as far as the, as it were, Brexiteers are concerned, by this argument that somehow this amendment, the meaningful vote, and the Lord's Amendment, as amended by my right honourable and learned friend, is really an attempt to get round the referendum. And I I found for the last several months that practically every subject, when the details get a little difficult and the argument gets a little odd, then you're not accepting the will of the people. I first face it when I opposed our withdrawal from Euratom, and I still don't believe the public voted that. So for the avoidance of doubt, first I repeatedly make it clear, much though I regret it, but I was on the losing side in the referendum, after the majority in Article 50, we are going to leave the European Union. I don't join with these campaigns to have a second referendum. I hope I never live to see another referendum on such an important subject in my life. The fact is, the key decision was then decided. I won't go back on the quality of the debate and the arguments put forward by the leading figures on both sides, which dominated the national media. But once the decision was taken by this House on the Article 50 invocation that we're leaving, hundreds and hundreds of other detailed questions arise about what new arrangements we're going to have for our relationships with the European Union on a huge range of subjects, some of which we haven't scarcely looked at the moment, and actually our relationships with the rest of the world, because all our trade agreements are all based on the European Union, because that's how we've entered into them for the last several decades. The idea that the yes-no vote, leave or remain, on the referendum day actually decided each and every issue that's now going to arise is, frankly, if I may say so with respect to people I actually genuinely have respect for, intellectually lazy. It is just refusing to engage with what we're actually talking about. I realise many of the public are exasperated that we are. The prevailing mood in the public is, you know, what are they all doing? Why don't they get over with it? I'm sorry about that. But the fact is, leaving poses a lot of questions. I do not think that most members of the public feel their vote decided the issues we're talking today, about parliamentary scrutiny and control. I can only guess that if we had said, of course, if you vote leave, you're giving the government the absolute right to do what it wishes in negotiations and come to whatever agreements it wants, I don't think it would have been easy for my right honourable and honourable friends to get a majority for that proposition. So let's get on to what we really are talking about, because I'm already taking longer than I wished. The only arguments against this, as I've said, in the past, any suggestion that the Parliament should hand over for absolute discretion to any government to handle such things would have been treated with absolute outrage. All these cheers and counter-cheers, any minister who dares... So it is said, the other argument, which the Honourable Member for Basildor obviously was persuaded by, and I don't agree with him, is that the next argument we're facing is, well, what you're saying is that the House of Commons should take over the negotiations. Well, of course we're not. That is a ridiculous proposition. I quite agree. What would happen if we had the House of Lords amendment proposed by my right honourable friend Lord Hailsham? So what about they'd all put a lot of thought into actually putting together a parliamentary process that would be practicable and workable. Probably the drafting could be improved, but the government could have done that if their lawyers thought that that was worthwhile. What they had in mind was a further resolution would be required. Now, the resolution that would come forward, the second resolution after the proposed settlement had been rejected, would of course be moved by a minister. And my right honourable and learned friend from Beaconsfield's amendment makes that even clearer. The idea we'd all have a mass meeting of 650 and decide what resolution we're going to put forward is not postulated by the House of Lords amendment. I've taken too long already. I'm very sorry. I apologise for that. Nobody's suggesting that. The government would, of course, be in a bit of a dilemma. I imagine we'd all be even more excited than we have been for the last few days. But the fact is, they would have to go away, work out what resolution they were going to bring forward that was going to carry the House of Commons, and I assume that would be a continuation of the negotiations, but the House would demand that its approval was sought for their next turn in the negotiations, the directions they were going to go to satisfy the objections. I regard that as a perfectly serious proposition. I think the public debate on the whole question of Brexit has largely been ridiculous, not just in the Daily Express, but in many other areas. But in this place, we do actually need to take seriously what we are doing, not only to the future prospects for generations of our citizens, but for the constitutional position of this House. We've already given up all kinds of things that I've always taken for granted. I've never known such a weak Parliament allowing things to get by, ending with the last timetable resolution. But to actually take the government's amendment will be the ultimate. It does set out, they've had to accept the decision of the House when we successfully defeated them before Christmas. They've had to come back and set out a better process of parliamentary approval before ratification. But then the big question is, what if the government rejects it? What if there's no deal? In the House of Lords, the Minister was quite clear in resisting this. Oh, this meaningful vote's going to be deal or no deal. I mean, take it or leave it. Yes, says my honourable friend behind me. That's what he wants. No, I'm not. So I said, yes, no vote. So you may not like the deal, vote against it, and all you get's no deal. Now, the result is, whatever deal they come forward with, only a handful of my honourable and right honourable friends would vote against it because they don't want any deal at all. But I think they're an absolute tiny minority in this House of Commons. What does the government say in its amendment that the House should be faced with? Within 28 days, a written statement will be produced amongst the piles of written statements we have every day. And dare I suggest, not every member of Parliament usually bothers to go through the piles of written statements we have every day. Well, obviously I'm exceptionally negligent in not doing so. But a written statement, what's the written statement going to say? It could say, well, in that case, there's no deal, we're leaving. It could say, well, we're going to do this and that's it. That's the end of the parliamentary process. It might as well say, oh, House of Commons, get lost. And that is an wholly inadequate response to the votes we had before Parliament. No, there's two more points. I really am going to be now very brief. The points I would have expanded on, I won't. The argument that we're undermining the Prime Minister's position in the negotiations is equally ridiculous. It is based on the proposition that out there, on the continent, they don't know there are divisions in the cabinet. They don't know what the situation is here in the House of Commons. And actually, were a whisper to get out with some slightly unusual votes in the House of Commons, this would undermine my right honourable friends and position and that of the Prime Minister and make it much weaker for them. I suspect the opinion on the continent at the moment is they're utterly bewildered by the Anglo-Saxons. They have no idea what we think we're doing. They're not hostile to this country. They're waiting for us to make our minds up what it is we wish to negotiate before negotiations start. All the other governments have got to get the approval of 27 national parliaments. What they're watching is an attempt by the real zealots in this House to stop this Parliament playing any part in the process, which is totally unacceptable. And I think the time has come to say, as it always should be, that all government policies on any subject, great or small, depend on the ability to command a majority in the House of Commons on the key principles and the direction into which the country is going. And I certainly, Mr. Speaker, will vote on that basis, and I hope the government regrets its rather intolerant response and all the pressure it's been applying on my right honourable and learned friends trying to resist such an obvious proposition.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always a daunting prospect to follow the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, although I'm grateful to him on this occasion for warming up the audience a wee bit for me. I don't often go along with the tradition, Mr. Speaker, of spending the first part of a speech being enormously grateful for being given the chance to speak in this place, because after all, speaking here on behalf of our constituents is the absolute right of all members. But today I think it's appropriate for me to acknowledge that I am one of the privileged few, because I'm going to get to speak sometime today, and who knows, maybe even tomorrow, whereas the vast majority of elected members in this place will not have a chance to speak at all. If we all got an equal say over the next couple of days, every MP would speak for about 10 seconds, and no, I'm not going to call time on myself just yet. Each of the amendments, many of them vitally important for our future, each of the amendments would be debated for about 3 minutes. In reality, of course, most MPs won't get called. We will be asked to vote on amendments which have never been in front of this House and which will literally not even be mentioned by name, rank or serial number during the debate, because there won't be time. Anybody who believes that that is an example of participative democracy at its best really does need to get out of here and spend some time reconnecting with the real world, because the programme motion that the government have got through today is an absolute travesty of democracy. Over days and days and days when business collapsed, when the government were inventing things to talk about because they didn't have the political courage to bring this bill, or indeed umpteen other Brexit-related bills, before the House. The idea that we can give proper consideration to 160, 170 amendments in effectively 9 or 10 hours of debate is utterly laughable. And I do think it's an indication of how far the hard Brexiteer propagandists and sloganisers have parted company with any kind of rational logic, that they, and indeed many in the government, denounced the Lords who approved 15 amendments the government didn't like, but welcomed the fact that those self-same Lords approved 166 amendments that the government asked them to approve. 166 amendments requested by the government. 15 amendments agreed at the request of the rest of the world, and it's the rest of the world who are the villains and the enemies of democracy in this. It was inevitable but deeply disturbing to see the way the battle lines have been drawn in the front pages of some so-called newspapers, and I know there was a point of order on this exact point raised earlier on today. The Lordships are the, quote, traitors in ermine, the enemies of the people, as indeed are judges in the Supreme Court, for daring to do the job that they are there to do. I'm not a fan of the unelected House of Lords, but they are there for a purpose, and whether we agree or disagree with them in the way that they discharge their purpose, the abuse that has been heaped on them in the last few weeks is utterly uncalled for and has no place in any kind of civilised debate. I'll give way to the honourable member at the back.
Honourable gentleman, because he's right to suggest that rather than us deriding the House of Lords, we should be thanking the other place for bringing forward 15 sensible amendments, but the government should also be thanking them for bringing hundreds of their own amendments because they made such a horlicks of the bill in this place in the first place.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member makes a very valid point. It seems that the definition of an enemy of the people is not based on where they take their decisions. It's based on whether the decision finds favour or disfavour with Her Majesty's government. That is not democracy, Mr Speaker. We're heading to dictatorship if someone's integrity or patriotism is judged by whether or not they agree with a minority of people who sit on the government front bench. As I've said, and as I'll come back to later on, I'm not a fan of the House of Lords. I don't think it's a democratic institution, but they're not the real threat to our democracy. The real threat to such democracy as we have in these islands doesn't come from people who disagree with what I say or with what the government say. They come from those who use terms such as traitor and enemy to denounce anybody simply for holding and expressing a view that differs from their own. This weekend, we will mark the 2nd anniversary of the murder of one of our colleagues. Possibly the last words that she heard in this life were death to traitors. Surely, in the name of God, we should know that when we allow the language of hatred to become normalised, the actions of hatred will follow. Today, someone has pleaded guilty to planning to murder another of our colleagues. I say to colleagues on all sides of the House, we can disagree passionately and fervently with each other, but please get the language of violence out of the vocabulary of this debate, out of the vocabulary of all debates, not just in the few days before we remember Joe's sacrifice, but every day thereafter, so that Joe and others did not die in vain. As I mentioned, Mr Speaker, the SNP are not fans of the House of Lords, but when the House of Lords have passed amendments to take a bad bill and turn it into a slightly less bad bill, then we'll be seeking to retain those amendments. And let's be clear, even with all those amendments, this is still a bad thing. It will be damaging to all of our interests. But if we can make it as least bad as we possibly can, then we'll have achieved something. I'll happily give way.
The honourable member saying that the SNP's official position is that they think we should stop Brexit outright.
Yes. I'm not quite sure how to break this to the right honourable gentleman. Nothing would please me more than to allow his country to implement the decision on European Union membership that his citizens have taken, and for my country to be given the right to implement the decision that people of my country have taken. So we support the removal of a purely arbitrary and symbolic exit day from the bill. It does nothing to improve our chances of getting a less damaging deal. It makes the prospect of a cliff-edge no deal more likely. It was only agreed to because the Prime Minister at the time was too weak to stand up to the hardline minority in her own party, who are a vanishingly small minority across this House of Commons as a whole. Now, recently, these ubiquitous sources close to the Prime Minister have been working very hard to spin the line that the Prime Minister is now prepared to face down some of the extremists in her own party. Could I suggest that she should make a good start by facing them down by supporting the removal of an unnecessary exit day from the bill and supporting the Lord's amendment that would bring that into effect. We also support those amendments that want to change necessary back to what the Minister deems appropriate. I'm flummoxed by the idea that it needs to be put into legislation that a minister only does things that the minister thinks are appropriate. Do the government seriously think that their own ministers are going to do things that even they think are inappropriate? I know they do things all the time that I think is inappropriate. Imagine having to legally prohibit them from doing things that they thought were stupid, rather than trying to stop them from doing things that everybody else thinks is stupid. Now, the Secretary of State, who obviously has much more important things to do than to stay and listen to the defence of his legislation, he told us twice that necessary is not a synonym for logical, sensible or proper. The trouble is this entire bill is written on the assumption that Her Majesty's government is a synonym for logical, sensible or proper. Indeed, that the whim of a minister is a synonym for logical, sensible or proper. The government does not have a monopoly of logic or of good sense or propriety. A government that lost its overall majority in this place at the demand of the people of these islands surely should have the humility to accept that sometimes, just sometimes, when the ermine-coated lords along the corridor disagree with them, sometimes the lords have got it right and the government have got it wrong. Mr Speaker, we'll also support amendments that seek to guarantee that Parliament has a meaningful choice and a meaningful vote on the final deal. This gets presented as somehow usurping the decision of June 2006. But who among us can genuinely claim to have the right to decide whether the final deal, whatever it says, properly delivers the Brexit that people voted for? None of us can, because nobody voted for any particular kind of Brexit. They voted for a Brexit. There was, I'll finish this and then I'll come back to him. There wasn't any public vote on membership of the Customs Union. Nobody voted to leave the single market. Nobody voted to leave Euratom. Nobody voted to damage the United Kingdom economy. People voted for a departure from the European Union. There has been no public vote as to the kind of Brexit we should have. And the reason that there was no referendum on the single market of the Customs Union is because the party opposite thought it politically expedient to deny the public that choice.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he confirms that he and his party want to keep Scotland in the European Union. Can he confirm to me if he wants to keep Scotland in the common fisheries policy as well?
We never have. No, we never have. Certainly not as currently constituted, of course. If we had a common fisheries policy, if there was a common fisheries policy that actually protected Scotland's fishing industry instead of being used as an excuse to sell them out as successive UK governments, it might have been a different matter altogether. There has, of course, Mr Speaker, been a public vote on the possibility of one of the consequences of a hard Brexit, on the possibility of a hard border across the island of Ireland. I'll give way very briefly to my colleague.
I've been aware today in the front page of the Financial Times of a shortage of doctors. We have the cheek of hearing the Tories in Scotland blaming the SNP for a lack of doctors when they don't give them the visas to get in. Now we have the Tories who have sold out fishing once and then twice, who told us in the transition agreement they wouldn't accept fisheries involved in it, talking again as if they're saviours of fisheries. The people who have sold out fishermen twice.
Well, Mr Speaker, few of us can speak with such knowledge or authority of the fishing industry as my honourable friend from the Heelan and the Yar. As I say, Mr Speaker, the nearest we've had to a public vote anywhere on any of the consequences of hard Brexit was the public vote against the possibility of a hard border across the island of Ireland. The people of Northern Ireland and the people of the Republic of Ireland overwhelmingly rejected such a notion when they endorsed the Good Friday Agreement. And of course the people of Northern Ireland, the only people in the United Kingdom who would be affected by a hard border, voted to remain in the European Union. How can anyone argue that the best way to give effect to those votes is for decisions to be taken by ministers representing a party with no members of Parliament in Northern Ireland, so that the people of Northern Ireland have no way of re-electing or not re-electing those ministers based on whether the decisions are in the interests of their people? I'll give way to the honourable member here first.
Thank him for giving way. Is he as outraged as I am that it looks as though we will have no possibility to debate those issues today? And is he also equally surprised as I am that unless the Department for Exiting the European Union has not kept its website up to date, we don't even have a minister from DEXU here listening to the debate?
I can assure the right honourable member that we are quite used to seeing government ministers abandoning their posts as soon as anybody from the third party in this Parliament gets up to speak, but they'd have to take it up with them as to why that might be. From the sponsoring department, I should say, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, that's why at the end of this entire process, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to each and every one of us to acknowledge that some members of Parliament later this year, possibly in the Conservative benches, possibly over here, may in all conscience want to go back to their constituents and say, I recognise the way that you voted in June 2016. I respect your right to take part in that vote. But in all conscience, I cannot be part of a decision that I believe in my heart of hearts will be deeply damaging to your community and to these islands, to these nations. Members of Parliament must have the right to say to their constituents, on this occasion, what I fundamentally believe to be in your interests differs from what you believe to be your wishes. And each of us should be given the right to go back to our constituents and to face the potential political consequences of that. I have no qualms whatsoever about the consequences for me politically of following my own conscience if it's against the wishes, expressed or otherwise, of my constituents. That is a decision all of us have to be prepared to take from time to time. This is possibly the most important occasion of this Parliament and of many previous Parliaments, when members of Parliament must be given the opportunity to decide for ourselves where do we place the balance between what we believe is best and what our constituents have told us they want. And if members of Parliament are not prepared to face up to that very difficult dilemma, there is a question as to whether they should be members of Parliament at all. I've already taken my honourable friend, so I'll go to the other side here.
I think he's been very generous in giving way, but surely we cannot ignore a referendum which was voted for by this House. The people made a decision, and then we go against that people's decision. And to say that perhaps they didn't realise what they were doing when they voted to leave the European Union is an insult to the electorate.
Well, Mr Speaker, I never suggested that, although it's perhaps worth remembering that at least one of his own colleagues, a Conservative MP, has admitted that they didn't vote in the referendum because the question was too hard for them to understand. I wonder how many other people were in the same position. There's a big difference, Mr Speaker, between not fully understanding and being stupid. I think it is an insult for members opposite to suggest anyone who admits they didn't fully understand it or still don't fully understand it is either stupid. No, I won't give way any further just now. But, Mr Speaker, my comments were not based on suggesting that people didn't understand. My comments are based on the fact that the ultimate responsibility that we have is to act in what we believe to be the public's best interest, not simply to follow what we think will get us re-elected next time around. And the fact that so many Brexiteers are horrified at the idea that members of Parliament should be given the chance to make that statement to their constituents suggests to me that there's an awful lot of them who think that such a statement may be needed, who think that we'll get to the end of the process and a large number of MPs will want to go back to the people and to say, I'm sorry I supported this down this far, but I cannot support it any longer because I can see the damage that it's going to be causing. Mr Speaker, I'll leave that for members to think about. I don't expect it to have persuaded anybody just now, but I do appeal to members, think about that over the next wee while. It's a fundamental to the nature of the representative democracy that we have in this place. And of course it goes without saying, among the other amendments that the SNP will be supporting, that in this partnership of equal nations, the elected parliaments of all the equal nations must have a say in the final deal. And when I say they must have a say, they must have a much greater say than they've had up until now, because the contempt that's been shown for the devolved nations through the process so far, it's difficult to believe that it's intended to be anything other than inflammatory. I won't give way because I know that a number of people who didn't support the programme motion will struggle to get in. This mantra of the most powerful devolved parliament in the world has never been true. But it sounds even more hollow if that most powerful devolved parliament in the world can be stripped of its powers by a party who never wanted it to have those powers, who never wanted it to exist in the first place, and who are intent on acting not just against the majority view of the Parliament of Scotland, but against the majority view of opposition members of the Parliament of Scotland. Mr Speaker, in their continued belief that they and only they are the guardians of common sense, the government are determined to force this place to have a binary decision as to whether or not we accept the final deal. The same government who keep telling us that the customs union is not a binary decision, the single market is not a binary decision, controlling immigration is not a binary decision. The only time it's a binary decision is when we have to make a decision. The government are determined that the final decision this Parliament will have to take on our future is take it or leave it. For some of us, Mr Speaker, other futures are available. And the government would do well to reflect on the fact, before it is too late, that if the only choice they offer is take it or leave it, They may find that the people of Scotland, the people of Wales and indeed the people of Northern Ireland will interpret, take it or leave it in a very different way from that which the government intended.
Order. I remind the House of what it knows, namely that time available for this debate is very, very limited, and I want to accommodate as many honourable and right honourable members as possible. So we're going to begin with a limit on backbench speeches of 10 minutes, though it is not obligatory to take the full allocation of time. Sir Edward Lee.
I agree with the honourable gentleman that we should use the language of respect. And I, for one, and I'm sure many of my colleagues would never use words like traitor. And we all accept that there are very different views in this place. But this is not the EU negotiating bill. It is not a bill designed from its inception to try and give the government guidance about what sort of deal we should have. I thought, and this has been explained to us many times by the government, that this bill was simply to try and transfer in an orderly way EU laws into our legal system. That's what I understood it to be. It's not an EU negotiating bill. I said earlier that we should use a language of respect, and I know that it's not in order to call any member disingenuous. But I do think it is in order to call an argument disingenuous. And that is what I do so now. I respect the House of Lords. I understand that they are not elected. I understand that they should try and improve legislation. I serve on the Procedure Committee. I understand that when we consider these matters in the Procedure Committee, there was a detailed debate on the Sifting Committee, and I could understand how the House of Lords could try and improve how we deal with legislation. That seems entirely sensible and credible. But many of us suspect that these amendments, particularly Amendment 19, is not designed to actually improve this legislation, not designed to improve the sifting process by which we transfer these laws. It is actually designed to frustrate the whole process. That is what we suspect. I give away briefly to my honourable friend.
Remember that we had many hours of debate and decisive votes before we sent the Article 50 letter. That was the point when Parliament made up its mind to back the referendum. We can't keep chopping and changing.
I agree with that. So, although, as I was saying, it's perfectly in order for the other place to try and improve legislation, when they seek to frustrate it, then I think people in the elected House should start to get worried. If we look at this Amendment 19, it is very clear. Her Majesty's Government may implement a withdrawal agreement only if Parliament has approved the withdrawal agreement and any transitional measures. Her Majesty's Government must follow any direction in relation to negotiations under Article 50, etc. It's a very clear amendment. What would be the result? I ask colleagues that they're not just acting in a vacuum here. What would be the result if we fail to overturn this amendment from the other place? No. Well, I agree the Honourable Lady does take a different point of view from me, so in all courtesy, that must be the last time I give way.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. Does my honourable friend agree that the amendment tabled by the learned member for Beaconsfield deals with the issues that you are that my honourable friend is raising?
No, I don't agree. And I talked to my honourable friend, the Brexit Secretary, earlier today, and he simply said, and he does understand these things, that all my right honourable friends for Beaconsfield and Member do is implement what the House of Lords want to do in fewer words. So I don't accept it, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that we have to bite this bullet now, and we have to support the government and reject it. I was saying, what would be the result? What would be the result? Because we don't operate in a vacuum if the House of Lords had their way. Of course, it would be a catastrophe for the government. There would be banner headlines in every single newspaper tomorrow saying that the government had been defeated, that the whole Brexit momentum was in danger. And much more important than that, and this is why I think this is disingenuous, is that those who support the House of Lords are dressing up their arguments in terms of parliamentary sovereignty. It is in order, is it not, for Parliament to debate, amend, as the other House of Lords can do, a bill. That's what we do all the time. But what they really want to do is create a situation in which the whole process is frustrated. And has been said again and again, we ourselves voted 6-1 to transfer this decision from ourselves, uniquely in our history, to the people. They decided to leave. The decision has been made, and we then voted overwhelmingly, virtually every single Labour and Conservative member, not only to do that, to accept the result, but then to implement Article 50. We've taken the decision. We are a sovereign parliament. We've made that decision, but we have given that decision to the people. So I repeat, and I go back to my argument, what would happen now if the House of Lords had their way and the government lost this afternoon? Many members, of course, opposite, they're entitled to cause confusion to the government ranks. I accept that they may have their own motives. But I appeal to my friends here. What would be the result to our government if we lost this vote today? What would be the result to our government? It would be a catastrophic blow. And I return to the question that I put to my right honourable friend early in this debate. What would the European Commission think of it? Now, my right honourable friend for Rushcliffe had a bit of fun about this. No, he had a bit of fun about this. He said, oh, of course the European Commission know that there are some arguments and debate. It would be an open invitation to the European Commission to actually pave the way for this catastrophic situation in which there is no deal, because they know if there was no deal, if there was going to be this disorderly exit, the House of Commons could unpick the whole process, block Brexit, as the Honourable Gentleman for Stoke said, and reopen the whole process.
These arguments are put, almost as forcefully as my honourable friends putting them, when we had the debates before Christmas on the committee stage. And this House then passed an amendment on a meaningful vote and defeated the government. Now, people had foreseen this would undermine the Prime Minister, cause an election, be a crisis. The next morning, apart from the fact there was now to be a meaningful vote, nothing stirred. The position of the Prime Minister was not weakened. The negotiations have not been hindered. These are, with great respect, they're arguments he's putting with his usual great eloquence, but they really are avoiding what we're really talking about, which is the important process of parliamentary accountability.
Well, I'm afraid that my honourable friend wasn't listening to his own speech. Did he not say earlier, was I not listening, was I not 2 or 3 feet away from him when he said that the amendment that we passed earlier wasn't going to make much difference to the whole process? It was about giving a statement, wasn't it? So this is completely different what we are talking about. This really is the ultimate wrecking amendment. And it's not wrecking of parliamentary sovereignty, it's wrecking of the will of the people. Of democracy. And there are so many things, so many compromises that we all have to make. So many things that I don't understand about this negotiating process. So many things I don't understand about how we've got stuck on the hook of Ireland. I don't know, so on the backstop, Max Fact, all these other things. But the essential is this. The people want us to leave the EU. They want to regain control of their borders. They want us to be out of the European Court of Justice. All this bill does, it is not the EU negotiating bill, it is simply to implement the will of the people. Parliament, don't stand against the people, implement their will.
Sir Vincent Cable.
Mr. Speaker, I think there are many people in this House who will be speaking under pressure or considering different interests. Some people who are observing what the member for Streatham described as the pure Churchillian principle of accountability, of thinking clearly about our conscience and our judgment.
Others will be concerned about the will of the people expressed by our own constituents or by other people's constituents or parts of the UK like Scotland, which are distinct. And others will be thinking about their party. Dare I say, some people may even consider the views of their party whips. And people will come to different conclusions and weigh these things in different ways. And the people who will be most vocal will be the people who are not necessarily balancing these with the greatest degree of difficulty. And I think we should respect them on both sides who are struggling to reconcile these different pressures. But the particular issue we're having to weigh here is a difficult constitutional question, and there are two constitutional questions which are both wrapped up in Article or Amendment 19 from the Lords. One of them is how we reconcile the rights of a plebiscite with the rights of Parliament, and we debated that many times, and the member for Gainsborough was very unambiguous about how he stood on that issue. But there is another one, which is how we balance the rights of the executive against the rights of the legislature, and we debate that in different contexts. A few weeks ago we were talking about war powers and accountability and exactly how we weigh those things. And I think that Amendment 19 takes us forward in one crucial respect, which is with regard to the so-called meaningful vote. It gives additional clarity. It might be better if we had taken the wording of the member for Beaconsfield, but it does give clarity. It does not have the exaggerated consequences which very sensibly were set out by the member for Rushcliffe. I'll take an intervention.
Well, gentleman for giving way, but will he not concede that when the Amendment 19 was brought forward in the House of Lords by the Noble Lord Billamoria, he said that this amendment has the ability to stop Brexit? Will he not concede this is a wrecking amendment?
But the House would have to vote in that way, fully conscious of that, and we'll just have to wait and see how the House chooses to treat it. The overall effect of this is clearly no, stopping Brexit is one of the options that we need to consider. But my view would be that although this takes us forward, it does not have the consequences, as Member Rushcliffe's just explained, the damaging consequences that many exaggerated predictions. It would not necessarily undermine our negotiating position. The European Union countries have their own legislation to consider. They have already made it clear they want a smooth, quick, clear Brexit. That's their objective. Anything that is potentially causing major disruption, if they were unfair to the United Kingdom, that led Parliament to reject the deal, is not something that would necessarily be in their interests, and they would, I'm sure, reject it. But the crucial point, which was made in the article by Professor Bognador, that the Brexit Secretary is quoted at length, is that whereas it is a necessary step, it is not sufficient. And it's not sufficient because Parliament cannot overthrow the judgments of the people in a referendum. And it's quite clear about that, and we're quite clear about that, that we're approaching it from the opposite direction of some of the Brexit supporters on the other side of the House. We believe that when Parliament has considered this matter, the matter should be put, the final deal or the absence of a deal should be put to the public, who should have the final say on the matter. This is not an extraordinary observation. Countries that rule by plebiscite, like Switzerland, regard confirmatory referendum as a matter of course. The people vote, legislature and executive then review the matter, and at the end of it there is a confirmatory referendum as to whether the people accept or not. There is no reason why that should present a problem. It's a matter of fundamental rights. No, I'll just complete what I have to say and let others do so. And our amendment 9A, which is on the order paper, it expresses this thought very clearly. And I noticed that the member for Bracknell, who more than any others probably today is reconciling these different forces, comes out very clearly accepting that the logic of the position is not simply to have the House to have a meaningful vote, but to go beyond that, to go back to the people and to accept the result of that vote. I can say from my point of view that were there to be a vote on the final deal, I would accept that fully. I would work with people who support Brexit to make Brexit work. But if we continue with the present path, with a definition of Brexit which is narrow and specific, as in the Lancaster House Agreement, supposedly drafted by the Prime Minister's advisor at the time, which many of us will not accept as a proper definition of Brexit, which is pursued in a stumbling and incoherent way, we do not accept that. And we will not accept it, and we will not accept the results of the Brexit negotiations even after Brexit has taken place. So there has to be a decision by the public at the end of the process to have a vote on the final deal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I think the Right Honourable Gentleman has completed his speech. Well, he can't give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman. He's concluded his oration. We await his thoughts at a later stage, perhaps. Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was amused to discover that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, was a little taken aback by my amendment tabled late last night. I tabled it with his best interests in heart. Having spent last week understanding that imminently he might be joining me again on one of these benches, and realising, in addition to that, that this amendment passed in the Lords, if endorsed by the Commons, might precipitate the same thing again, I thought that in the circumstances I ought to do what I could to help him. And that is why I went and tabled my amendment in addition to the one he has put in view to the House of Lords. I really am worried at the moment. I have to say this to the House. The irrationality of the debate we are having on the details of Brexit is truly chilling. You open your newspaper and you discover that you are about to prevent Brexit from happening, when what this House is doing is legitimately looking at the details of one of the most complex legal and political exercises we've ever engaged in peacetime. As a result, the ability to have rational debate entirely evaporates. And if we continue this way, we will make mistakes, and we will not, in fact, achieve the best possible outcome. The House of Lords was not acting irrationally in its amendment, which it tabled. It had picked up something which ought to be of great concern to everybody in this House, namely that although we can make provision for achieving a deal, if in fact we don't achieve a deal at all, the fact is we are going to be facing an immense crisis. I mean, there may be some of my colleagues on this side of the House who are excited at this prospect and think that it's a wonderful moment. I'm not. I think it will be catastrophic. And so the question is, how do we take some sensible steps to anticipate that happening and try to make sure that there is a coherent process for dealing with it? That's what this is about, not about obstructing Brexit. In any case, if we want to obstruct Brexit, if we want to obstruct Brexit, there's plenty of other ways of doing it. We can replace the government and put in place a government that would like to stop it, although we still have to get the consent of our EU partners, having triggered Article 50. So there is a complete constitutional incoherence in imagining that this legislation, in the way it's being presented, somehow leads to that dastardly outcome. I give way to my honourable.
Well said. On the learned friend for giving way. My concern about his amendment is that it changes the constitutional balance in the separation of powers, and that there is a perfectly reasonable way of ensuring the government does the proper thing, which is a vote of no confidence. And that as long as the government maintains the confidence of this House, it ought to be able to negotiate international treaties. But that if it fails in its negotiations, then this House has a remedy, which has been a remedy for very many years.
I take my honourable friend's point, but I'd just like him to consider for one moment the latter part of my amendment, Part C, which deals with what happens if on the 15th of February 2019 we have no deal. his invitation would be for the House to express no confidence in the government and to get rid of it. Can one imagine a more chaotic process than the triggering of a general election 5 weeks, five weeks before we fall off the edge of the cliff? Justine, give way.
I agree with what he's saying, and I think far from suggesting that his amendment is wrong, actually the intervention we just heard gives the very reason why it's sensible to process to deal with the different scenarios this House may face.
Well said. I agree entirely with my right honourable friend. And just to explain, I did take on board the government's concerns in the Lord's amendment, that the micromanagement of the government's negotiating position after the autumn, if there were no deal, was something which I could see could present difficulties. So my amendment sought to avoid that by doing two things. Firstly, to provide a mechanism by which no deal, if there is no deal, has to come to this House, and that will provide great reassurance to all honourable members that we have a system in place to deal with it. Similarly, a system in place to deal with a rejection of a deal, and finally, and it's only then that there would be a mandatory condition, if by February we were still faced with an impossible position of having no deal at all. I give way to my honourable and learned friend.
To my right honourable friend, and of course accept that both he and other honourable friends wish to discuss further the role that Parliament will play in all the Brexit scenarios that may present itself to us. We can't bind the negotiations, nor can we disrespect the referendum result. But we do commit, as my right honourable friend the Secretary of State said in his speech, to meet to see how we can build on Her Majesty's Government amendment in lieu today, ahead of the Lord's stages, and we will arrange to meet my right honourable friend tomorrow in order to make that important progress upon what we have achieved today.
I take at face value those comments, and I'm most grateful to my honourable and learned friend for making it. Yes. But he's got to understand that, as usual when we get to this stage of the process, we face some quite difficult challenges. There is a Lord's amendment. Of course, if we were to agree the Lord's amendment, that is what is going to go into the bill. If, however, we endorse the government's approach and support the amendment in lieu, and my own amendment, I think, could be adopted by the government. It's a rather arcane procedure, but they could include it. But if they don't want to do that, I need to have some pretty cast-down assurances that when this bill goes back to the Lords, with the government's amendment in lieu, we will implement significant parts of what I have put forward, because we cannot allow a situation in which there is no mechanism for dealing with no deal. I give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Overnight, I have read very carefully the amendment that he tabled, and I think, for example, with regards to 5A, there is much merit in the approach that he urges this House to adopt. Can I say that I need more time to think about the other parts of his amendment, but by indicating my position on a key part of it, I am indicating that the government is willing to engage positively ahead of the Lord's stages.
Again, I'm very, very grateful to my honourable and learned friend, and I don't, if I may say to the House, I don't think his views should be dismissed, because I'm conscious that if we're to make progress, we ought to try to do this by consensus. But he must also understand, as my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, must understand, the difficulty the House faces is in when it is faced with this kind of choice. I've been through this before when I'm in opposition, and now that when we are in government. Because if the House makes the concession of allowing the dialogue to continue, and I can see the merit of that happening, it has got to be done in good faith. Without that, we will face a situation where, in fact, firstly, I may say to him, the other place will put it back in, and secondly, the goodwill will be gone when it comes back to this House. So I think it's really a very important issue. I give way to him again.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Can I give him that assurance, and that everything I do with him and other colleagues is always in good faith, and that will remain the case.
may I say this to him as well? I'm grateful to hear that the principle, which in my view is entirely innocuous, that within 7 days of a statement under subsection 4 being laid, a minister moves a motion in the Commons to seek approval for the government's approach. I mean, that really isn't exactly rocket science. The second one is that there has to be a mechanism for coming to this House by a suitable date. I think the end of November 2018 must be the one, in the event of no deal, so that the government tells the House how it intends to proceed and seeks the approval of the House for that. And finally, I say to him that on C, which I know causes him much more difficulty, I understand the constitutional issue. I just want to come to that before I finish. But the reality is that if we don't have a mechanism by which this House can properly shape the crisis that will be enfolding us at the end of February if we haven't got a deal, then we will do it in an ad hoc way which is likely to be infinitely more damaging to the well-being of the citizens of the United Kingdom than putting together a package which can be used, can be actually looked at now. I give way to it.
As usual, I'm listening very carefully to my right honourable friend's observations. Can I say that they will form a clear basis for a formal set of discussions that we can start at the earliest opportunity ahead of the law?
Order. I do apologise, but the Minister must address the House. This isn't a private conversation with another member conducted sotto voce. I want the whole House to hear what the honourable gentleman wants to blurt out, preferably briefly.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, and I was just finishing by making that clear undertaking to use the right honourable gentleman's comments as the basis for a structured discussion ahead of the Lord's stages.
I'm grateful to my honourable and learned friend, and the House will obviously have to make up its mind how it wishes to proceed on this. But it's got to be, as I say, a proper understanding of the disquiet that is felt and which is across the House about... Yes, I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Notwithstanding, obviously, the statements that have been made by the Solicitor General in good faith, would it not be therefore best to enable those discussions to happen in a forthright way for us to vote with their lordships for their lordships' amendment, and then the government can return to the matter in the House of Lords after the discussions?
I fear not. I think that the reality is that if we accept the Lord's amendment, that is the end of the matter, and that's the problem that we face in this House. It is the end of the matter. We accept the Lord's amendment, and that is the end of the matter. I give way to my right honourable and learned friend.
My right honourable friend. He and I both accept, without hesitation, the goodwill of the Solicitor General, and he is doing his best to resolve a slightly odd situation we're all in. But does he not accept, I think the reality behind this is, I don't know about my honourable friend, the right honourable friend, the Solicitor General, the majority of ministers would give him the undertaking he's asking for now. Yes. And actually, the majority of our party quite happy to have an arrangement of the sort set out in his amendment. You can only give, all we can have is, as we had in committee, offers of good faith, discussions, earnest attempts, because they're going to be vetoed by the hardline Brexiteers in the government.
On to the intervention. Mr. Dominic Green.
I'm grateful to my right honourable and learned friend, and just as this debate unfolds, we'll hear more about it. I just want to say one thing in conclusion. No, I'm sorry. One thing in conclusion. One thing in conclusion. The idea that it is wrong in a crisis for the Parliament to direct the government what to do is plainly fallacious. It cannot be right. We are entitled to do that. Of course, if the government doesn't want to do it, that's another matter.
Thank you. Order. We'll have one more speech of up to 10 minutes, and then the limit will have to be cut because I want to accommodate the maximum number of colleagues. Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. With some hesitation, I want to involve myself in the negotiation that clearly the government is trying to attempt with its own backbenches. I simply want to observe that this is the single most important amendment that we will be discussing today and tomorrow in relation to the role that Parliament should and indeed must play in determining what kind of Brexit happens. And I simply do not accept the argument that the Secretary of State and other members on benches opposite have made in trying to suggest that this is somehow illegitimate or improper or is seeking to overturn the result of the referendum. Is it improper for this House to decide that in leaving the European Union we wish to remain within a customs union with it? Is it improper for this House to decide that we wish to remain in a single market, that we wish to continue to have the European arrest warrant system, that we want to cooperate in future with our friends and neighbours on foreign policy, defence and security? Now, if the answer to all of those questions is no, it is not improper, then this amendment that the Lords have moved is about giving Parliament the ability to ensure that it can exercise that judgment when the time comes. Because what it seeks to do is to make it clear who will be in control when we come to the end of the process. Because the government can go away and negotiate, but it will have to win the consent of the House when it returns. Now, the government's attempts to neuter the Lords' amendment will not work for a number of reasons that have been set out already. Frankly, we don't have more time. I say to the Solicitor General, we do not have more time, which is why this is the moment when we have to make the choice. And secondly, as it's been clearly pointed out, it makes no provision for what happens in the event of there being no deal. And the House is aware of what the consequence of no deal would be for the border in Northern Ireland, for our trade, for the rights of British citizens abroad and EU citizens here, and future cooperation on security and many, many other matters. So that I will give way once.
If very interested in what the Honourable Gentleman has just outlined, and isn't it equally fascinating that, given all he's just outlined, that when Brexiteer MPs here ask themselves about a vote on Brexit, they fear they will lose that vote, and their thought is that Brexit will be reversed. It surely shows no confidence in their argument at all, especially given those points he's outlined.
Well, I would say to the Honourable Gentleman, the British people have made their decision about the fact that we are leaving the institutions of the European Union in March of next year. But it is for this House to decide the way in which we leave and the future of our relationship with our friends and neighbours, who will remain our friends and neighbours after we have left. And so the question, because many others wish to speak, so the question, Mr. Speaker, is who decides in the circumstances, either of there being no deal or of Parliament rejecting the deal that the government brings back in October or November, what happens next? Now, in the event of a rejection, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Parliament will, in moving an amendment to the motion asking for approval of the withdrawal agreement, set out its reasons why. Parliament might say, for example, we decline to give approval to the withdrawal agreement because it makes no provision for the United Kingdom remaining in a customs union with the European Union. Now, in those circumstances, Mr. Speaker, as many members, including the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the Father of the House, have made it clear it is perfectly reasonable for the House of Commons then to expect the government of the day to go back to those with whom it has been negotiating, as always happens in negotiations. People come back and say, I'm really sorry I've tried, as the Chief Whip is now experiencing, but the members won't wear it. We need to talk about doing something else. It is perfectly reasonable for the House to do that. Otherwise, as we have heard many times, the notion that we have somehow taken back control has no force whatsoever. Now, we need a mechanism that can enable the House to have its say, both in the event of there being no deal because an agreement cannot be reached, or in circumstances where the House of Commons says we do not accept the deal that the government has brought back. And the final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is this. Members have spoken, and we will hear from others, no doubt, subsequently, with real passion and concern about this means of ensuring that the Parliament can have its say. And I've read in the newspapers over the weekend people saying, is this really the right time to be voting not with the government and in support of the Lords. And while you could argue that in relation to the big question of whether we should remain in a customs union or the single market, because there will be other opportunities that will come before the House in the trade bill to do that, that is not true of this question of a meaningful vote. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is the one opportunity before the end of these negotiations in October, the one opportunity that we have to decide. Indeed, my honourable friend is correct. It is the only opportunity to make it clear to the government that we intend to have our say when the negotiations have been concluded. This is the one chance that we have, Mr. Speaker, to exercise the sovereignty that all of us believe properly rests with this House. Whether we voted leave or we voted remain in the referendum. And I hope very much, Mr. Speaker, that the House, recognising that it is its one chance, will take that opportunity by voting later today for Lord's Amendment 19.
I'm sorry to disappoint colleagues, but it's in the spirit of maximisation. A 6-minute limit now applies. Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've never written a speech before and then had it typed out, and now I don't know why I bothered. Not only have you cut the time, but you can see how the debate has advanced. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to speak as ever, frankly, but this has got to stop. This is unseemly. This is the most important piece of legislation that this House has considered, arguably since the Second World War. And we sit here and we watch a peculiar sort of horse trading between a perfectly excellent amendment put forward by my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, who served in government for decades, who during that time never won a number of years. But he's served this party for decades and he's never rebelled once. And I gently say to the honourable member, probably a right honourable member for Gainsborough, who rebelled in just 8 years, 58 times. To the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, who along with my right honourable friend for Chingford, between them, rebelled in total 160 times. We here understand the concept of being loyal to leadership and indeed being true and honourable to your principles, and I believe they are men of conscience and principle. But look around us, Mr. Speaker, and look at what is happening. There are people, unfortunately, who are no longer in our cabinet, good men and women of great ability and indeed courage, whether it's my right honourable friend for Ashford, whether it's my right honourable friend for Putney, Hastings or Ashford. All great people who've been lost from our deeply divided cabinet. Never before have we been in a situation where we have a cabinet who is so divided, where some of its most senior people who hold the greatest offices of state at every twist and turn, when our Prime Minister moves towards securing a Brexit that will serve everybody in our country, the softest, most sensible of Brexits, both publicly and privately, they undermine her and they scupper her attempts. Mr. Speaker, it simply has to stop. And that moment is now. I absolutely know that the Solicitor General is a man of great honour, whose word will always be true. But with the greatest respect to him, he is not the most senior person around today, and it is not his decision, and he knows I says that as somebody with great respect and love for him. So where is the Secretary of State? All he has to do is accept the amendment of my right honourable and learned friend. If he doesn't, he will force people who for decades have never rebelled before to traipse through lobbies or sit and abstain, just as they did in the Lords, and I will support them in each and every one of those important amendments on the EEA, on the Customs Union and on Amendment 19. Members of this place once, including amongst them a former Chief Whip, a former Deputy Prime Minister, more Secretaries of State than you could shake a stick at, a former Leader of the House, two former party chairmen. Mr. Speaker, you know that for decades they were always loyal to every leader. Unlike some, I'm afraid, who for decades have plotted and connived, they've got rid of leaders, anybody and anything that have stood in their way, and they will continue so to do, even if they are supported by Russian bots and their dirty money. And they will do what they have had a life's ambition to do, which is to take us over the cliff into the hard Brexit that my constituents did not vote for. And I will continue to represent my constituents. We reckon 52% voted leave, and the 48% who voted remain, and they've been put to one side in this process and they've been ignored, and that has to stop. And we have to come back together and we have to do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, I know and I understand how difficult it is for many of my colleagues to go through lobbies and vote against their party, but I say this. I am getting a little tired of honourable members and right honourable members on the backbenches, in government, even in the cabinet, who come up to me and others in quiet and dark corridors, to British businesses who demand private meetings where they lay bare their despair but refuse to go public, to the commentators who say to me, "You're doing a great job, keep on going," in the face of death threats which mean that one of our number had to attend a public engagement with 6 armed undercover police officers. That is the country we have created, and it's got to stop. To the journalists who fight nobly for every cause, but on this most important of issue, are mute. It's got to stop. Everybody now has to stand up and be true to what they believe in. And finally, Mr. Speaker, there were some great words that were spoken. Give me time to, if I may, find them and read them out, and I probably lost them. The House is made up of 651 robust individuals whose position gives them a powerful say in what the executive can and cannot do. The powers of the House are sovereign, and they have the ability to upset the best laid plans of ministers and of governments, which no minister ever forgets, and nor should any backbencher. They were true then, they're true now. They were spoken by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Accept the amendment.
Thank you. And Mr. Chris Leslie.
The Honourable Lady spoke with passion and clarity, but she spoke above all about courage and about putting our country first. And I would like to particularly at this moment pay tribute to the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Bracknell, who has done just such that thing today. Because at personal sacrifice to himself, he, and potentially, who knows what the electorate may do in the future, but he is using his judgment, making an assessment about what is the best interests for his constituents, and I find that something to be greatly respected. I was fascinated, Mr. Speaker, to hear the exchange between the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield and the government front bench a moment ago. It seems to me that the obvious solution here would be for the government to signal that it is accepting the amendment in lieu tabled by the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield. No, I'm not going to give way. There's lots of others who want to speak. No,
sit down.
To accept the amendment, because in doing so, if the House then approves that, as it would, because it would be done so by consensus, that issue would then go to the House of Lords, where, through the discussions that might then subsequently take place, there would then be the opportunity, if those discussions wanted to amend it or tweak it in a particular way, for the other place to send it back here for final confirmation. But if the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield were to not do that, were to simply sort of take, and I understand sometimes taking the word of ministers and so forth, the leverage of this House would potentially be lost if those discussions came to naught. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful. I mean, we have to be realistic. There is an issue here. If the government wanted to accept the entirety of the amendment, it could probably be done this afternoon, and that would be the amendment that goes back to the Lords incorporated in theirs. But in fairness to the government, I've always appreciated that there might be some tweaking to be done. And I understand that. But that having been said, there needs to be some certainty, he may agree with me, that the substance of this amendment will come with the acceptance of the government in the other place.
That is right, and a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and I would suggest to the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield that having that amendment in the bill as it goes to the other place can always decide to tweak it, change it, following the discussions, but far better to have that on the face of the bill as it comes back. That is the way in which what feels to me to be the majority view of the Chamber today can have that sense of certainty that something will be done. Because it isn't just a matter of one minister. Ministers' words can be given. No, I won't give away. But ministers' words can be given, and then they can change, and ministers can come and go. We in this House, across the Chamber, need that level of certainty, and of course we'll accept the fact that there will be further discussions. Mr. Speaker, this issue, this question about taking back control, was put to us consistently throughout the course of the referendum. And as somebody was saying earlier on, we obviously can't call other honourable members hypocrites, but we can point out the hypocrisy in general of an argument from those who might have said in one breath, take back control, who then have the audacity to come here and say, oh well, the UK Parliament is clearly to be cut out of this particular issue altogether. I think we were all elected, in fact I know we were all elected in 2017 on a mandate subsequent to that referendum. Our mandate collectively has a value, and we shouldn't diminish that and pretend that we should be cut out of this process altogether. This is not a binary question where there are so many things at stake. I do not believe that the British people voted to take control from Brussels only to give that control unilaterally and in its entirety to the Prime Minister and her friends. This is a matter for us, and our constituents would expect nothing less for us to say, hang on a minute, what about their jobs in the manufacturing sector? What about the car industry? What about those who work in the financial services sector? All of those people working in those sectors have a right for us to do our job with due diligence. And the honourable member for Rushcliffe, Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, who quite rightly points out that we could find ourselves, who knows, in a situation where no deal is reached. That the discussions and the negotiations collapse, and there is no certainty that the motion would then come forward. When the Secretary of State was intervened upon, well, what would happen if no deal were to materialise? He said, oh, well, the government would come forward with a statement. And when honourable members said, well, how are we going to prevent us falling over the cliff? No answer was forthcoming. No this is an incredibly important point. We have a duty to safeguard our constituents from harm. That harm could not just affect their livelihoods and their jobs, but it would also affect all the revenues that taxpayers pay towards our public services. So if you care about our NHS, you have to make sure that there is a safeguard in place. If you care about schools and you care about council services, you need this insurance policy in place. You would not go through such a crucial, important issue without having that particular safeguard. Yes,
I thank my honourable friend for giving me. Can I say two things to him? We should recall this. If you remember, during the general election, the Prime Minister herself said that she was being obstructed in Parliament and needed a big majority. Well, she got her answer during the general election. But coming back to another point my honourable friend made, and it's very important, the Midlands relies on trade, and we shouldn't jeopardise those hundreds of thousands of jobs in the West Midlands.
And my honourable friend says it perfectly. We have a duty to do. We would be failing in our duty if we were to simply say, delegate all of our decisions to the Prime Minister in her entirety. Well, that's it. Everything has been done. It wasn't on the ballot paper about customs union, legal customs union, and single market. All of those things are issues which we have a right to express our view on. I want to conclude, because the other problem about the deal when it comes is about this issue of the future relationship. Because my constituents expect that when that motion comes, if there is a deal, it isn't just about the divorce proceedings and the money and that process of leaving. It has to be about what our future relationship is going to be. If there is simply a side of A4, a flimsy statement of words, the famous fudge that we are so now used to hearing about, stapled as an annex to the back of that, that will not be acceptable. We have a duty to press ministers to do a deal properly that safeguards our constituents' interests. And as MPs, we must make sure that we exercise that pressure on government to do this properly. Now, I hope that the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield, who clearly does, I think, now have the majority of this House, because we wouldn't see the Government Chief Whip scuttling around so rapidly. I've never seen him move so quickly in his life before, trying to find a form of words. I hope that he will take the opportunity to put his amendment in lieu in the bill now, send it to the House of Lords. They can always amend it, change it, look at it again, and we can come back to this next week, do it properly. It wasn't our fault that there's only 12 hours allocated to this whole ridiculous process. We could have had far longer. The government have made their bed, and they have to now lie in it. They set up this particular process, and they can't realistically complain, oh, I didn't have a chance to read this overnight, oh, I haven't quite seen it. They have to, if they want to do a particular change, they need to accept the will of the House now. They can always put down amendments in the House of Lords. That seems to me the best way forward.
The last speech on the 6-minute limit. Sir William Cash.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Somewhat troubled by what the Honourable Gentleman has just said, not least of which because he wants to kick it back into the House of Lords. I thought the whole argument with respect to the amendment that Viscount Hailsham put forward was that it was to do with the primacy of the House of Commons. Why are we going to go back to the House of Lords and ask the House of Lords for an opinion when in fact it's this House which voted 6-1 in favour of our having a referendum act at all, and in further to that, endorsed by the decision that was taken by the people to leave the European Union. That is what is now being put under pressure, and it is complete nonsense, I would say junk, to suggest that in fact this amendment about the meaningful vote is not in fact an attempt to reverse the decision of the people. Of course I will.
It's been said that my right honourable friend for Beaconsfield amendment is a compromise. People should read it. 5C is absolutely clear. It says if no political agreement has been reached, then the government must come back for a resolution in the House of Commons. This is exactly the same as 5 in 19 of the Lord's Amendment. It is not a compromise, it is a wrecking amendment.
Well, I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. I was just about to make that very point, because I have in front of me the two texts of the different amendments. That they're not that different, because actually in both cases it says that we would be expected, the government would be expected, I use the words must in the text of both, must follow any direction in relation to the negotiations under Article 52, which has been approved by a resolution of the House of Commons. What on earth is this supposed to mean? There is no way in which this House of Commons, 650 members of Parliament, can arrive at a motion as to prescribe what the government is going to do in relation to negotiations. It is not simply a question of whether or not we're somehow or other departing from normal constitutional procedures. It's that this amendment is complete nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. And furthermore, I would say this. What would the resolution say? I heard the Right Honourable Member who chairs the Select Committee for Exiting the European Union, talking about the customs union, the single market and so forth. But of course, this amendment here, this proposal, talks about approving a resolution of the House of Commons. Who would devise it, I say? But furthermore, what would the resolution say? How on earth would you get 650 people to agree either on what the motion would say or on what the outcome would be? So all I have to say, and I wanted to make this very brief intervention on this point because I have listened to this debate with great interest, and I have to say, I will give way to my honourable friend, but I will say this, that actually this is just a cover for a reversal of the decision. It's got to be said, and it's got to be said clearly. And I do find it quite extraordinary that there should be some attempt to throw it back to the House of Lords so that they can then tell us, we, the people who are elected by the people of this country, who themselves have been given the right by the transfer specifically of the responsibility to make the decision on behalf of themselves and their families and future generations. This, Mr. Speaker, is what people fought and died for, which is who governs this country. And I say,
Order! The honourable gentleman must be heard. I've never known the honourable gentleman shouted down, and now's not going to be the first time. Sir William Cash.
Quite a good job to shout down the shouter-downers, but the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that this is something about who governs this country. This country is governed ultimately by an Act of Parliament which gave the sovereign right to the British people. It was a deliberate transfer. It was a voluntary transfer. And the primacy of the House of Commons rests in this. It was done by 6-1 in this House, and there are people on the other side of this House who did vote for that referendum. I certainly give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. As he knows, I'm not a Ramona. I'm completely committed to delivering Brexit. But I don't think he's being fair to the thinking behind this amendment. And could I just say this? There are many of us committed to delivering Brexit. Our fear is this, and the question for him is this. If we ended up in a situation, I don't want to tie the Prime Minister's hands. I don't want to put her negotiating in Europe at the whim of this great, colourful Parliament. I want her to be able to go and negotiate. But if we were to vote down a deal or have no deal, is his view that this House is then locked into accepting no deal, or that this sovereign House at that point should have the ability to say to the Prime Minister, go back and push harder?
I absolutely disagree with the notion that in this House we have the right to overturn the decision that has been taken by the people, and furthermore that the approval on the terms of this amendment, which I've already read out, is completely unacceptable. I repeat, what it says is the government must follow any direction in relation to negotiations under Article 50, which has been approved by resolution of the House of Commons. I say that that is not acceptable for one simple reason, and that is this: that the decision was taken by the people. We gave them that decision, and we have to stand by it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable gentleman has concluded his oration, and we're grateful to him. OK, the time limit is now reduced with immediate effect to 4 minutes. Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the most important point is that we should not be complacent about no deal. First of all, for security reasons. That was precisely the point the Prime Minister made in her letter to Donald Tusk, notifying the European Commission that we were leaving the European Union. She said, in security terms, a failure to reach agreement would mean our cooperation in the fight against crime and terrorism would be weakened. I don't think that that was a threat. It was a very simple statement of the truth, of the fact. And consequently, we should not be complacent about the fact that there may be no deal, because I don't think the Prime Minister is. However, we should also not be complacent, because I fear that when you look at the Venn diagram of what the Chancellor of the Exchequer will vote for, and the Foreign Secretary will vote for, and Conservative members of this House will vote for, and Parliament will vote for, and, for that matter, the European Commission will allow, there's not much Venn in that Venn diagram at all. So there is a real possibility that we will end up with no deal. And that's why I say to the government, and I say to the Solicitor General, we have to have a resolution of this matter today. Not in future days. A resolution of this matter today. And I was wrong when I said to the former Attorney General earlier that if we just accepted the Lord's amendment today, then we could come back to it. That was wrong. What is true, however, is the point that has now been made by several members, which is the Solicitor General could accept the former Attorney General's amendment, and then it could go back to the House of Lords, and then they can tidy it up afterwards if they want to. And I honestly say to the Solicitor General, I think that that is the view of the majority of members of this House. I think, if I'm honest, it's his view as well. And also, for that matter, if the Secretary of State were in here, if he weren't the Secretary of State at the moment, it will probably be his view as well. And it certainly was always his view in every previous debate that we've ever had, that the fundamental principle is, of course, the government governs, but in the end, Parliament governs the government. It has to be government by consent. And my anxiety about the way the government has conducted this whole process is that they don't seem to think that they've got enough power. But surely the processes before us today show that the government has phenomenal power. We can only vote on matters that the government allows us to vote on today. The only way we can move forward on the amendment that's been tabled by the member for Beaconsfield is if the government minister allows it. The government has phenomenal power in our system. And this is just a brief moment when I think this House would like to say to the government, go on, you know that that's what the will of the House is. There's no need to divide the Conservative benches. There's no need to divide the House on this. Just accept the amendment from the member for Beaconsfield, and we can all move forward.
Thank you. Dr. Philip Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Resigning ministerial office has been an incredibly difficult decision. It was in order to support my right honourable friend, my learned friend, and indeed trusted friend, in his attempt to amend the government's amendment to Lord's Amendment 19. And I am devastated to have taken this decision. I owe this House an explanation, and there are 4 points I would make. For me personally, this is a matter of deep principle. I believe in the Burkean principle that our institutions guarantee our human rights. Most important of all, a government's first responsibility is to protect its citizens. This is usually understood in military terms, but I believe it applies more generally. It means that sometimes when a majority of our people want something that is against the good of society, government and Parliament have a responsibility to protect us. This was the case with the death penalty when for decades politicians went against the majority view and refused to reinstate it. Now I believe it needs to be the case with the Brexit process.
Will the honourable gentleman give way?
Of course I will give way.
Congratulations and well done, sir.
I thank my honourable friend for Broxley. I believe that there is growing evidence which shows that the Brexit policy our government is currently pursuing to deliver on the 2016 referendum is detrimental to the people we are elected to serve.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
Can I congratulate my honourable friend for his courageous decision? And would you agree with me that there is no majority in this House or in the country for a destructive, cliff-edge, no-deal Brexit?
I would agree with my honourable friend, and I would also add that I am not convinced that there is a majority for such a Brexit in my own constituency. It is fundamentally important that Parliament should have a voice so it can influence the final outcome in the interests of the people it serves. A fake choice between a potentially bad deal and a cliff-edge no deal, a vote between bad and worse, is not a meaningful choice. It would breach such fundamental principles of human rights and parliamentary sovereignty that we would not recognise it as being valid in other countries. It is not that our Parliament should accept. It is not one that our Parliament should accept. In all conscience, I cannot bring myself to vote for it in this bastion of liberty, freedom and human rights. The people of my constituency of Bracknell are my first and most important responsibility as their Member of Parliament. Certainly it now seems inevitable that the people, economy and culture of my own constituency will be affected negatively. And I cannot ignore that it is to them that I owe my first responsibility as their Member of Parliament. I must be able to speak out on their behalf on this greatest political issue of our age. It is important at this point to clarify that the Brexit vote in the Bracknell constituency in the 2016 referendum was not clear-cut. The Bracknell Forest part of the constituency was marginally in favour of Brexit. the Wokingham part was more strongly in favour of Remain. But this is not about whether we Brexit or not. I voted to remain in the 2016 referendum and still believe that despite the European Union's manifest flaws, this would have been the better strategic course for our country at the time. In this interconnected world, it is nations with allies that will thrive. But we cannot and should not turn back the clock. The point is that if Brexit is worth doing, then it is worth doing well. It is a huge sacrifice to give up ministerial office. For the last 2 years, I have been completely committed to enabling our criminal justice system to serve our society better, in a small way bringing some influence to bear to help make our society more just and secure, and the experience has been deeply humbling. I am incredibly sad that I cannot reconcile continuing in ministerial office with representing my constituents' best interests or my own integrity. I fully support Theresa May's leadership and strong Conservative government. It would be dishonourable and indeed unprofessional. It would undermine the leadership that the Prime Minister and our party can give our country and that it so badly needs at this time, if I were either to keep quiet or to criticise the government's approach from within. In politics, as in the medical profession, trust and integrity are fundamental. The principle of collective responsibility is also important, and that is why I felt that I had to choose this course. I urge my parliamentary colleagues to follow my lead and vote to give our great institution, this House of Commons, our constituents and our country the powers it needs to leave our children a legacy of which we can all be proud.
Kate Hoey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member who's spoken said that Brexit is worth, if Brexit's worth doing, it's worth doing well. I absolutely agree, Mr. Speaker, and I absolutely agree that that's what people in the country want to see, Brexit being done well. Brexit being done well means leaving the European Union and leaving it properly, getting out of the single out of the single market, not being in the customs union. If we stay in either of those, we're not really leaving the EU. Now, the Lord's Amendment, I really just want to say a few words why I want to very clearly urge this House to send Amendment 19 back to the House of Lords. I spent a very, I was going to say interesting, but not particularly interesting, even a few hours reading right through the entire House of Lords debate. I'm sure most of the colleagues have here. And I regret very much that many of the leading Lords made it very clear that they wanted to stop Brexit. I believe that in this amendment, dressed up as it is in the words of parliamentary democracy and using parliamentary democracy as the key to why it's being put, is actually not right and not true. And if that means being disingenuous, if that is the word we have to use, I will say it is disingenuous. I'd like to say a probably stronger word, but I will give way to my own.
Right on, lady, for giving way. And also, did she note in the Honourable Gentleman for Twickenham's speech, he talked about the rights of the Parliament. He didn't talk about the duties of the Parliament. And the duty of this Parliament is to implement the wishes of the British people.
I agree with the honourable member, and I also think that the Lord's Amendment, the people of this country will see through it. They will see that this is really, no, I won't. This is really about actually trying to go back on Brexit. They can say it what it is, but what they want to, but it is actually about reversing it. Because the reality is that we want to take back control, but taking back control was about the people of this country taking back control. And it was about complying with our constitutional duties as a parliamentary democracy. And that means, and I just find it absolutely amazing that anyone would think that the European Union Commission that we've seen trying to be as negative as possible, as difficult as possible, that they would really think that once we start negotiating, knowing that if at the end of the day we are going to, whatever deal it is, and if we don't manage to get a very good deal, we say no, that then we would be sending it back to renegotiate. Do you really think the Mr. Speaker, members really think that the European Commission will actually give us a better deal, knowing that if they don't give us a good deal, and if they the more obstructive they are, the more likely it is that it will be sent back to them to renegotiate? The reality is the European Union Commission do not want us to leave. They do not want to give us a good deal. They want to punish us. And this motion, this amendment, no I won't, this amendment, if it goes through, I believe actually is a recipe for the EU to actually try to get a no deal, so that we will then have to go back cap in hand from this Parliament and ask for changes. And what they really want is then those changes to stay in the single market, to stay in the customs union, to still have the Court of Justice overlooking us, to keep paying our money, to keep paying more and more money, and to reverse the decision. So, Mr. Speaker, I think whatever is said today, this is really about whether we believe that we give the people the right to have their say. We said it in a letter that went to everyone, costing a huge amount of money. This is your decision. The government will implement what you decide. I will give way to the right honourable member.
The honourable lady for giving way. And would you also reflect on the fact that, in addition to the referendum, at the last general election last year, both parties stood on the ticket of leaving the customs union, ending freedom of movement, repatriating our laws. It was quite unequivocal on both parties, and that result needs to be respected.
I think the honourable member is very right that all the manifestos talked about honouring Brexit and by leaving the customs union and the single market. Labour put it in a slightly different way, a slightly more nuanced way, but that's what they were people, particularly in leave areas, they were going round and telling people in Labour that we would be leaving the single market and the customs union. So I really just want to say finally then that this is for me a very, very important vote today. This is, as someone else has said, it's absolutely crucial that we do not allow the Lord's amendment to be carried. And I believe that today we have to make a decision. We either support those 17.5 million people who decided and voted to leave, or we are actually going to say that we're going to be allowing people who really want to stop Brexit by using different procedural mechanisms, by using legal challenges, legal words to put this in doubt. And I'm confident that at the end of it, we will not decide to allow the Lords, the unelected Lords, full of ex-EU commissioners, full of people who are being funded by the European Union, to actually decide what we're going to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
3-minute limit now. Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful. In the 3 minutes that I have available, let me just focus on, I think, what is at the heart of the argument made by the right honourable gentleman, the member for Beaconsfield. He is trying to deal with a situation where we either can't reach agreement or where this House doesn't support the government's policy. Now, I think his approach is well-meaning. He is trying to do the right thing, as the solicitor indicated from the front bench. But I think the amendment as drafted is flawed for 2 reasons. I am reasonably attracted to the first 2 parts, where he gives the government an opportunity to set out an overall strategy and invite the House to support it, which I actually think would strengthen the government's hand. But I think the third part of his amendment is deeply flawed, because it has a time limit after which this House would give the government detailed instructions. And I fear we must remember, this is a negotiation. If I were on the other side of the negotiating table, I would look at that mandate, I would stall and delay until the government was in a position where it was either forced to take whatever poor deal was on offer, or that it was forced by this House to do so. That, I know, isn't the intention of the right honourable member, learned member for Beaconsfield. So it seems to me that the solicitor, who is a man of great honour and is making the offer he made on behalf of the government, the right way forward is for the House to support the amendment that has been put forward by the Secretary of State, and for that discussion to take place and the very clear commitment that has been given that the government will bring forward an amendment in the House of Lords that reflects the discussion that has taken place. I think that is the right way to achieve the outcome that we all want. Now, some in this House who've spoken in this debate to advocate this course of action advocated leaving the European Union. I, like many colleagues who are nervous about the amendment put down by the Secretary of State, advocated remain. I accept the decision that the public have made. I want to reach a good deal, but I want the Prime Minister to have the best possible opportunity, the strongest cards to play to get us that deal so that we can bring forward to this House a deal that we will find acceptable and that we can support. So that is the course that I think my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield, ought to follow, and those that support him, and I think the solicitor set out the right course, and I urge my colleagues to follow it.
Stephen Doughty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I saw the headlines in The Sun and the Daily Express this morning, I was utterly horrified. The tabloids, those particular tabloids, don't own patriotism when it comes to this country, Mr. Speaker. And when you hear a speech like that given by the honourable gentleman for Bracknell, you know that there are patriots on all sides of this House who are willing to vote with their conscience, with their constituents and with the interests of their country at heart. And that is what I intend to do throughout this process, is what I have been doing, it's what he has clearly made clear that he is going to do, and I hope that all members will be examining those three things when they vote today. Mr. Speaker, we have talked a lot about taking back control in this place. Unfortunately, the government has at a whole series of times attempted to frustrate the ability of Parliament to get the sort of information that we have about their plans, whether that was keeping those papers in the Treasury, attempting to frustrate the release of others. They've attempted to frustrate the process around this. Even for those of us who have a whole wide range of views on Brexit and where it should go, they're attempting to say it's their way or the highway. That is not acceptable, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I will be supporting the Lords in their amendment on the meaningful vote, and it's why I hope all others will be doing so as well. Mr. Speaker, this week, a constituent of mine, Alex Kalinick, who campaigned with me for a Remain vote in the referendum, sadly died a week before his wedding, just in his 30s. He was an individual of great integrity and great passion. He worked in the steel industry, but he believed passionately in having a close economic relationship with our European partners. We lost earlier this year another good friend, Will Cousins, a young man who campaigned passionately as part of the Strong Green campaign, as part of Open Britain. And of course we lost our very deeply missed friend, Joe Cox, nearly 2 years ago, who, like me, was also passionate about our relationship with our European neighbours. And I just say this, Mr. Speaker, we are in this place, and indeed in this life, for a very short time. And there are some things which we will compromise on and we will make amends on and we will move over. But when it comes to the very, very big issues, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to those defining issues of our time, this is one of them. We should be voting with our conscience. We should be voting in the interests in our country, and we should be doing that in the interests of a better future for all of our constituents.
Charlie Elphick.
Mr. Speaker. When I'm in Dover High Street talking to people, and I talk to them about this sort of situation with Europe, they say to me, why haven't we left already? And then I say, well, we now have debates on things like meaningful votes. And they said, well, we had a meaningful vote. We had a meaningful vote in a referendum 2 years ago, and you guys up in Westminster are just endlessly rediscussing the referendum that we had. And in that referendum, I backed Remain. I thought that leaving Europe would be a big project. It would take up a lot of our capacity as a country, and I urged my constituents caution. My constituents were really clear. They wanted to leave the European Union. And I think we need to respect the referendum, and I take a very pragmatic approach that, having had the instructions of my constituents, the clear view of my constituents, my duty is to discharge the instructions which I have very clearly been democratically given by the people whose masters they are. They are my master, and I am their. They are my master, and I am their servant. So their wishes and requirements ought to be honoured, and that goes for the country as a whole. The country as a whole had a referendum, made a decision. We need to make it work. We need to get the best position for Britain. And that brings me to the next question. When people say, well, Parliament should approve this, what's really meant by this? And what will they think across the Channel? What deal will they want to offer us? Because they're not stupid in the European Commission. They can see how the numbers stack up in our Parliament. They can see that if they offer us any kind of rubbish deal, that the government would be in a position with this meaningful vote, if it's passed, that they will be having us over a barrel as a country. And if you want this country to have a really bad deal, if you want to measure the level of problems at this country in billions of pounds, if you want us to get a situation where we get the worst possible accommodation and the worst possible departure from the European Union, then this is how you would achieve it. And that is why I have utmost respect for my right honourable and learned colleague, the member for Beaconsfield. I would say to him, this is not the right way to do it. You can't micromanage a negotiation, but worse than that, you cannot have a negotiation where you can not walk away from the table and the other side know that you'll never be able to walk away from the table. And that is why I urge this House to take the pragmatic approach today and to support the government's amendment in lieu, which will enable us to have an effective negotiation and support the national interest.
Hear, hear. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to make a few remarks in the debate today, focusing on the Lord's Amendment 19, which is a fundamental question about the engagement of Parliament in the process and the outcome for Brexit. Mr. Speaker, the argument has been made that this essentially has been put forward to frustrate the process, but that could not be further from the truth. At its heart, Mr. Speaker, this is a debate about what we mean by a meaningful vote. The Prime Minister and other senior ministers have promised Parliament a meaningful vote, and I echo the words of the noble Lord Hailsham, who said that in a parliamentary system of government, parliamentarians, and in particular members of the House of Commons, have a right and a duty to determine what is meant by a meaningful vote. Mr. Speaker, if the decision of Parliament is to reject the terms on good argument or after effective scrutiny of the deal, then Parliament should have the right to determine and suggest further negotiations or options on how we move forward. There is an important principle which did not get as much of a hearing or an airing in the Secretary of State's speech as I would have expected, and that is on the role of Parliament. Because isn't it right that whatever the outcome, deal or no deal, this country's future should be determined by Parliament, ultimately by the House of Commons, and not by ministers, in a parliamentary democracy. And that is what ought to be meant by a meaningful vote. Mr. Speaker, it is in the interest of this country for there to be an orderly, stable and predictable Brexit process that enables businesses and families to plan ahead and do all they can to manage the risks of transition, a point made to me often by businesses in my constituency. And if the government are as confident as they make out about getting a good deal, then they should have no problem in accepting the amendment today or the amendment in lieu. I will give way.
The Honourable Lady Figginway, but won't she concede that if by adopting Amendment 19, she claims that she's very worried about the fact that we could have a bad deal or no deal, that by adopting Amendment 19, she's more or less guaranteeing that the EU will offer us a bad deal to create that constitutional crisis in our country?
I thank the honourable member for making his comment, but I don't agree with him, Mr. Speaker, and I'll move on. Mr. Speaker, I want to make this point, which is that legislation is not just passed in this House to plan for when things go well, but to provide protections and a route map for actions when things do not go well.
there may well be an honest intention to reach a deal by October 2018, but there is no guarantee. And I am not talking down the government's negotiation attempts, but there is a reality and a possibility that this could happen. So let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. In my view, this is not about an unnecessary extension or thwarting of the process. It is about providing for clarity for the circumstances that may arise in this House about what happens in those final months before Brexit. This can only be helpful in managing the risks of Brexit for our country, in the event that a deal is well underway but not reached, or that a deal has not been agreed. It would certainly not be against the spirit of the referendum result, and at that time could precisely be in the national interest.
Thank you. Mr. Kevin Hollinrake.
Mr. Speaker, I speak as a Remainer who voted to remain, who campaigned heavily to remain, and who would do so again if we ever had another referendum. Not that I am advocating that position. And I think it is fair that members on either side of the House raise their fair concerns about the economy, about the effect on jobs, on frictions on trade. I myself, Mr. Speaker, as you know, are still involved in business to this day. It would have a personal potential impact on me. So it's quite reasonable that colleagues will want to see the substance of this deal. That is the temptation. But it is not a position I advocate. For a number of reasons why. The Prime Minister has sought to mitigate the effects of leaving, even under difficult circumstances. We should take into account the fact that our exports to the European Union account for around 12% of our trade, 12% of our economy. So we've got to keep this in perspective, but also that the Prime Minister's approach, quite rightly, is a staged approach to withdrawal. Stay in the customs union until we get customs processes, maintaining regulatory alignment until we negotiate a reasonable second approach. But the Amendment 19 raises the prospect in subsection 5 that we'll follow any directions that Parliament would give us, and the same with my honourable friend for Beaconsfield in terms of 5C, which raises the prospect that Parliament will simply send the government back to the negotiating table. But what at that point? What will happen at that point if we go back to the negotiating table? And the European Union will, or potentially would say no. What happens at that point? There is no clarity on that position. It opens up and allows the possibility, of course, for staying in for an extended time, with no clarity how long that will be. It may be months, it may be weeks, it may be months, it may be years. And we should also remember, of course, that we are negotiating with the other side of the negotiating table does not want the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. So it does raise the prospect of them being even more difficult in those negotiations. Negotiations that would be very difficult in the first place. Very briefly.
I give the honourable gentleman given way. I've heard a number of times that the meaningful vote might enable or would enable the European Union side to give a bad deal. I would argue it's the contrary. A UK government with any wit about it would say to its negotiating opponent, say, we'll never get this through Parliament unless it's improved. It actually strengthens their hands in any negotiation, not weaken it, if they've got any wit about them.
I find that assessment of circumstances very hard to follow. We're not negotiating on our own. We're negotiating with another party that clearly it is in their interest. Their interest to put a bad deal on the table in that situation. But it would delay the exit. It would delay the process. That's effectively what these amendments are seeking to do. It will delay the process. I'm not saying my right honourable friend is looking to frustrate the process of Brexit, but it would delay the process of Brexit, raise the possibility of that process ever happening at all. We are handing over the negotiating advantage to the EU. And I would say, happy to give way.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? Can I further reiterate the commitment that I've given on behalf of the government of the dispatch box to further discuss the matter with my right honourable friend, the member for Beaconsfield, and others? I'm particularly interested in Part A and also Part B of his proposals, and want to use that as the basis of a structured discussion as we reach the Lord's amendments.
Does the honourable gentleman others wish to speak as well? Mr Hollingreik.
I'm about to conclude, Mr Speaker. This is handing over the negotiating advantage to the EU. It raises the prospects, whether members intend so or not, that we may never leave, and members on either side of the House should not support it.
I'd like people to speak for 2 minutes each, no more. Mr Brake.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. First of all, I'd say to the Secretary of State, if he goes naked to the negotiating table, flaunting it all, it's because he and other of his supporters have conducted their ideological warfare in the airwaves and in our newspapers, not because of any votes we might have here today. Now, Liberal Democrats, we've tabled Amendment A to Lord's Amendment 19, which will provide people with a final say on the deal, an opportunity to test the will of the people. And I don't quite understand why the government and indeed the Brexiters are so scared at the concept of testing the will of the people. Absolutely. We've heard a lot about the will of the people, and I must say that it is in fact now the only reason the government can deploy for supporting Brexit. If we look at economic grounds, we know from the impact assessments it's going to do us damage. Diplomatic grounds, our friends despair with what we're doing. Security grounds, we hear threats and counter-threats about not delivering on the security agenda. Savings, we know there aren't going to be any because, amongst other things, the government are going to have to set up a whole series of parallel institutions doing exactly the same thing as EU ones. And on trade, do we really think we're going to get a huge boost from trade when Trump is there as a protectionist president? So 19A provides the people with an opportunity to have their views known on this subject against a background in which much has changed since the referendum vote 2 years ago. It'll give them a say on the final deal, something that they are entitled to, that they deserve, and I think would put this issue to bed once and for all. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The key difference between the Lords and the Government Amendments 19 and 19A is that in the event of a no-deal scenario, the Government Amendment simply requires a statement, whilst the Lords Amendment effectively grants Parliament a power to issue negotiating directions. It looks attractive on the face of it to say that if the government can't deliver, then the Commons should be able to step in. However, on these procedural amendments, I do see the other side of the argument. It is governments that negotiate treaties under the terms of the royal prerogative, and it is the executive that governs. And I'm not one who would wish to undermine this concept, except in the most extreme of circumstances. And that, Mr Speaker, is what I've been weighing up over recent days. I do also recognise that the government proposal in 19A concedes the Lord's request that Parliament should gain a legal right to veto in an international agreement. I believe that this would be the first time that this has been allowed in law in the UK. And it moves us into line with the European Parliament approvals. So it would be fair to say that in the last few days, government has gone some way to address concerns on this issue. In my considerations, I've been also no little influenced by the Prime Minister, who I sincerely believe wants the best deal possible for the UK and who is asking to go to the June EU meeting with a free as hand as possible. But if the Prime Minister gets the deal this country needs, even with the government concession in 19A, there is still no plan B if Parliament were to then reject the deal, which is why I think the new compromise tabled last night by my right honourable friend for Beaconsfield moves towards the balance required in terms of retaining both constitutional integrity and practical requirements. And I was very pleased, therefore, to hear the Secretary of State saying that this issue will now be looked at again in the Lords, and the Solicitor General to reinforce that in his earlier comments.
2 minutes. Frank Field.
There's been two great dramas being played out. The Father of the House said, how do we, as a representative system of government, implement a referendum result? But there's been a drama on this side of the House as well. 2/3 of Labour constituencies voted to leave. And one of our great problems, I'm not disputing, if you want to give way, give me another minute, I'm not trying to impute anybody's motives. But when we came to sign up for the referendum, we normally have 4 sides of A4 additions to the vote. People didn't believe. I give way.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. Can I just say, with regard to the issues that we've all been discussing, that I and the government are looking very carefully at amendments which might be tabled in the other place, and that will of course be the product of any discussion that I have with the right honourable gentleman, member for Beaconsfield.
But for the referendum, no 4 sides, but a small telephone directory of people who generally talk about, in a disdainful way, as saying they've not nowhere else to go. My real concern is what happens to representing those key Labour interests. I hope there is going to be these further discussions. And could I, in the process of coming to a good resolution and making sure the majority of the 2/3 of the Labour constituencies are well represented, may I be part of any of those private discussions?
Antoinette Sandbach.
I want to say how grateful I am that the Lords have given the consideration that they have to this bill and improved it considerably in sending it back to us. I do accept that the Solicitor General has given an important concession today, and I would have supported the Lords' amendment had that concession not been made. But I believe I'll give way.
I think it would be very helpful to the House if she could spell out in a little bit more detail exactly what the consensus is.
Time is up. Under the order. Order. We're all governed by the programme motion, which the House voted to agree.